Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Nightmare Narratives. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now let's get you comfortable, and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Billy Moonwater, and I've been a park ranger for 12 years now. I work the Blue Ridge Parkway in North Carolina, and let me tell you something. I thought I knew these mountains. My grandpa was Cherokee, and my other grandpa made the best moonshine in 3 counties. I grew up hearing stories about both sides of my family, but I always figured the scary stuff was just talk, until I tasted cursed moonshine. It was October 1977, and the leaves were turning red and gold like fire on the hillsides. I was sitting in my ranger station when the phone rang. The voice on the other end was all business. "Ranger Moonwater, this is Agent Sarah Collins with ATF. We need your help." ATF meant alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. They chased after people who made illegal liquor, moonshiners like my grandpa used to be. "What can I do for you?" I asked. "We've got 2 agents missing in your area, Tom Morrison and Lisa Park. They were tracking a moonshine operation up on Devil's Backbone Ridge." I knew Devil's Backbone. It was a narrow ridge that looked like the spine of some giant buried monster. Local folks had been making moonshine up there since before the Civil War. It was also the place where my grandpa went missing when I was 10 years old. "When did you last hear from them?" I asked. 5 days ago. They radioed in that they'd found the operation. Then nothing. 5 days was a long time to be missing in these mountains. Even in October, the nights got cold, and there were places a person could fall and never be found. "I'll head up there first thing in the morning," I said. "Actually, we need you to go tonight. We found their vehicle." That changed things. I grabbed my gear and met Agent Collins at the trailhead. She was a small woman with serious eyes and a no-nonsense way of talking. "The car's about 2 miles up," she said, pointing her flashlight toward the dark trees. "Fair warning, there's something strange about what we found." We hiked up the old logging trail. The moon was almost full, casting weird shadows through the trees. I could smell something sweet in the air, like corn mash fermenting. That made sense if there was a still nearby, but this smell was different, stronger. It made my head feel fuzzy. "You smell that?" I asked. Agent Collins nodded. "Been getting stronger the closer we get." We found the government car parked beside the trail, doors wide open. But it was what was inside that made my skin crawl. The back seat was full of mason jars, the kind moonshiners use. The liquid inside was clear like regular moonshine, but it glowed with a soft green light. "What the hell?" Agent Collins whispered. I picked up one of the jars. It was warm to the touch, and the glow got brighter when I held it. Inside the liquid, I could swear I saw shapes moving, like tiny people swimming around. "Don't open that," Collins said quickly. Morrison's partner opened one back at the office, started seeing things that weren't there. Had to take him to the hospital. I set the jar down carefully. In all my years in these mountains, I'd never seen anything like this. My Cherokee grandpa used to tell stories about spirits in the forest, but I'd never believed them. "Where did your agents go from here?" I asked. Collins pointed up the ridge. "Footprints lead that way, but Moonwater, there's something else. The footprints change." "Change how?" "See for yourself." She led me away from the car. Sure enough, there were boot prints in the soft dirt, 2 sets, heading up the mountain. But after about 50 yards, the prints got weird. They started to look less like boots and more like bare feet. Then the toes got longer. By the time we'd followed them 100 yards, they didn't look human anymore. I knelt down and studied the tracks. I looked like a cross between human feet and animal paws with claws at the tips. "This doesn't make sense," I said. "That's what Morrison radioed in before we lost contact. He said the tracks were changing as he followed them." A chill ran down my back that had nothing to do with the October air. I'd heard stories about Devil's Backbone my whole life. Stories about witches who could change shape. Stories about moonshine that could do impossible things to people. But stories were just stories, weren't they? "We need to find your people," I said, "but we should wait for daylight." Agent Collins shook her head. "Can't wait. There's supposed to be a federal raid tomorrow night. 6 more agents are coming in. If Morrison and Park are in trouble, I need to know what we're walking into." So we kept following the tracks. The sweet smell got stronger as we climbed higher. Through the trees, I could see a faint orange glow like firelight. As we got closer, I could hear something that made my blood run cold. Singing. Women's voices, singing in harmony. But the words weren't in English. They sounded old, ancient. "That's Scots Gaelic," I whispered. My Scottish grandpa had taught me a little when I was young. "What are they singing about?" I listened harder. The words were hard to make out, but I caught enough to get the idea. "It's about making moonshine," I said. "But not regular moonshine. They're singing about catching souls in jars." Agent Collins looked at me like I was crazy. But before she could say anything, we came around a bend in the trail and saw something that changed everything. There was a clearing ahead, lit by the biggest copper still I'd ever seen. It had to be 10 feet tall, with pipes running in directions that hurt my eyes to follow. Around it, women in old-fashioned dresses moved like they were dancing. They were pouring things into the still, herbs, water, and other stuff I couldn't identify. But what made Agent Collins grab my arm were the 2 figures sitting beside the fire. One was a man in a government suit. He was sitting perfectly, still, staring at nothing, while one of the women poured glowing liquid down his throat. The other figure was harder to see, but it looked like a woman in modern clothes. She was stuck to a wooden post like a scarecrow, but she was moving, struggling. "Morrison and Park," Collins whispered. That's when I knew we were in trouble. Real trouble. The kind of trouble my grandparents' stories were full of. Agent Collins started to move toward the clearing, but I grabbed her arm. "Wait," I whispered. "Something's not right here." "Of course something's not right. Those are my people down there." But I was looking at the women around the still. They moved wrong. Too smooth. Too graceful. And when the firelight hit them from certain angles, they looked transparent. "Collins, how long did you say your agents have been missing?" 5 days. "Why?" I pointed at the man by the fire. "Look at him. Really look." She pulled out her binoculars and focused on the figure. After a moment, she went very still. "That can't be Morrison," she said. "Why not?" "Because Morrison's been dead for at least a week." The man sitting by the fire was definitely dead. His skin was gray, and there were dark stains down the front of his shirt. But he was still sitting up, still letting the woman pour liquid into his mouth. Some of it ran out through holes in his neck. "We need to get out of here," I said. But it was too late. One of the women around the still turned toward us. Even from 50 yards away, I could see her eyes glow green in the firelight. She smiled, showing teeth that were too sharp, and raised her hand. The sweet smell in the air got stronger. Much stronger. My head started spinning, and I could hear Collins gagging beside me. "Run," I managed to say. We stumbled back down the trail, but the forest felt different now. The trees seemed closer together. The path kept turning and directed. Bonds I didn't remember. After what felt like hours, we came out beside the government car again. "How did we get back here?" Collins asked. I looked at my watch. We'd been gone for 20 minutes, but it felt like we'd been walking for hours. "The moonshine," I said. "It's in the air. It's messing with our heads." Collins was looking at the jars in the back seat again. Morrison radioed in about this. He said the liquid moved on its own. As if responding to her words, the liquid in the nearest jar started swirling faster. The green glow got brighter, and I swear I could hear tiny voices coming from inside. "We need to call for backup," Collins said. But when she tried her radio, all we got was static. Then, through the white noise, we heard singing again. The same Gaelic song we'd heard at the still. "Let's try from higher up," I said. Sometimes you can get better reception from the ridge. We hiked up toward Devil's Backbone, staying away from the trail that led to the clearing. The singing got louder as we climbed. By the time we reached the ridge, it was coming from all around us. That's when we found Jake Bradley. Jake had been making moonshine in these hills longer than I'd been alive. He was a good man, never caused trouble for anyone. But when we found him, he was standing waist deep in his own mash barrel. At first, I thought he was just drunk. Then I realized he wasn't moving. At all. "Jake?" I called out. He turned his head toward me, and I almost threw up. His eyes were gone, replaced by holes full of bubbling liquid. His skin had turned the color of old wood, and there were things growing out of it that looked like mushrooms. "Billy Moonwater," he said, but his voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. "Constance wants to see you." "Who's Constance?" Jake smiled, and liquid ran out of his mouth. "Your grandpa's old partner. She's been waiting for you to come home." The name hit me like a punch to the gut. My grandpa had mentioned Constance McBride a few times when I was little. She'd been a moonshiner, too, back in the old days. But she died in the 1700s. The locals said she'd been hanged as a witch. "Jake, we need to get you help," Collins said. Jake laughed, and the sound was terrible. "Can't help the dead, Agent Collins. But don't worry, you'll join us soon enough." That's when the smell hit us again, stronger than ever. The world started spinning, and I could hear Collins hitting the ground beside me. The last thing I saw before everything went black was Jake sinking deeper into the barrel until only his head was showing above the bubbling mash. When I woke up, I was lying beside the government car again. The sun was coming up, painting the sky pink and orange. Collins was next to me, just starting to wake up. "What happened?" she mumbled. "I think we got drugged," I said. "The fumes from whatever they're making up there." Collins sat up and checked her watch. "We lost 6 hours." I looked around. Everything seemed normal in the morning light. Birds were singing. The sweet smell was gone. The jars in the back seat weren't glowing anymore. "Maybe we imagined it," Collins said hopefully. But when I looked at the trail, I could see fresh tracks in the dirt. Bare feet with long toes and claws, and they led straight to where we'd been lying. "Collins," I said, "I think they could have killed us any time they wanted. So why didn't they?" I thought about what Jake had said, about Constance waiting for me to come home, about my grandpa. "I think they want something from me first." Collins was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "The raid is tonight. 6 agents are coming in with full tactical gear. You need to call it off." "I can't do that, not without proof of what's happening here." "Dead agents aren't proof enough?" "Morrison and Park are missing, not confirmed dead. And even if they were, that doesn't mean we're dealing with anything supernatural. Could be a cult, could be drugs, could be a lot of things." But I knew better. I'd grown up with the stories. I'd seen my grandpa's face when he talked about the old days. There were things in these mountains that were older and stronger than the government. "Then I'm going with you," I said. Collins shook her head. "This is federal business now. And this is my mountain. Your people don't know these woods. They don't know the stories. They're going to walk right into a trap." She was quiet for another moment. Then she nodded. "All right, but we do this my way. No splitting up, no investigating on your own. We stick together and we get out if things go bad." I wanted to tell her that things had already gone bad, that they'd probably been bad for a long time and we were just noticing now. But instead, I just nodded. We had 12 hours until the raid. 12 hours to figure out how to fight something that shouldn't exist. We spent the morning trying to make sense of what we'd seen. Collins used her radio to call back to headquarters, but she couldn't get through. Every time she tried, the static would clear for a moment, and we'd hear that singing again. "The interference is coming from the ridge," she said. While she worked on the radio, I hiked back to my ranger station to get supplies. More importantly, I wanted to look through my grandpa's old things. If Constance McBride was really back, I needed to understand what we were dealing with. I found his journal in an old wooden chest. Most of it was in Cherokee, but there were English parts too. The entries from 1967, the year he disappeared. made my blood run cold. October 12th. Constance is back. Found fresh moonshine in the old still, but nobody's seen her for 10 years. The liquid glows like foxfire. October 15th. Jake Bradley says his mash is fermenting too fast. Says it talks to him at night. Told him to stay away from Devil's Backbone. October 18th. 3 local boys went missing near the ridge. Found their clothes by Constance's old still. Clothes were empty, but standing up like scarecrows. October 20th. She came to me in a dream. Says she needs help with the final batch. Says she's been waiting 200 years to finish her work. I told her no. October 21st. Going up to the ridge tonight. If something happens to me, tell Billy to stay away from Devil's Backbone. The woman up there isn't human anymore. That was the last entry. My grandpa had gone missing on October 21st, 1967, exactly 10 years ago. I drove back to meet Collins with a truck full of gear and a head full of questions. She was waiting by the government car, looking worried. Any luck with the radio? I asked. I got through to headquarters for about 30 seconds, long enough to tell them to call off the raid. And? They said the team was already in the air, 6 agents in a helicopter, landing at sunset. I checked my watch. We had 4 hours. There's something else, Collins said. I went back up the trail while you were gone. That was stupid. I told you not to go alone. I stayed back, used binoculars. Billy, there are more stills up there now, at least a dozen. And there are people working them. People? Dead people. I recognized one of them from a missing person report from 1975. Local moonshiner named Pete Hawkins. This was getting worse by the minute. If Constance was bringing back all the old moonshiners, we were dealing with more than just one witch. Did you see Agent Park? Collins nodded grimly. She's still tied to that post, but she's changing. Her skin looks like burlap now, and there's straw coming out of her clothes. Changing into what? A scarecrow. A living scarecrow. I thought about my grandpa's journal entry. Found their clothes by Constance's old still. Clothes were empty, but standing up like scarecrows. Collins, I think I know what they're doing. They're not just making moonshine. They're making it out of people. Before she could respond, we heard the helicopter. It was coming in from the south, flying low over the tree line. We watched it circle the ridge once, then head toward a clearing about a mile from Devil's Backbone. We need to warn them, Collins said. We grabbed our gear and headed up the mountain as fast as we could. But the sweet smell hit us before we were halfway there. This time it was so strong, it made my eyes water. Cover your nose and mouth, I said, pulling out a bandana. It helped a little, but I could still feel the fumes getting to me. The forest looked different, more colorful, but also more threatening. The trees seemed to have faces in their bark. The shadows moved when they shouldn't. We heard gunshots before we reached the landing zone. When we came through the trees, we found chaos. The helicopter was on its side, rotor blades broken. There were 6 federal agents scattered around the clearing, but they weren't fighting back anymore. They were dancing. Each agent was moving in a slow, hypnotic circle, their weapons on the ground beside them. Their eyes were rolled back, and they were all smiling, these horrible, empty smiles. Standing in the center of the circle was a woman in a dress from another century. She was tall and pale, with long black hair that moved in a wind I couldn't feel. In her hands was a jug, and she was pouring liquid into the mouth of the nearest agent. Constance McBride, I whispered. She looked up at me and smiled. Billy Moonwater, I've been waiting for you. Her voice carried across the clearing like she was standing right next to me. Agent Collins raised her gun, but Constance just laughed. Iron can't hurt me, child. I died by rope and iron 200 years ago. Pain is just a memory now. One of the dancing agents, the team leader, Captain Rodriguez, suddenly stopped moving. His eyes focused on us for a moment, and he mouthed one word. Run. Then Constance poured more liquid down his throat, and he started dancing again. What do you want? I called out. The same thing I've always wanted, to perfect my craft. Do you know what I've learned in 200 years of debt? Billy, I've learned that the human soul is the finest ingredient in any recipe. She gestured to the agents. These men will make excellent reserve stock. Federal agents have such strong spirits, they'll add authority to the batch. Let them go. Oh, I will. In about 6 hours, they'll be free to go anywhere they like. Of course, by then, they'll just be empty jars with their spirits inside. Collins grabbed my arm. We can't help them, not like this. She was right. There were 6 trained federal agents under Constance's spell, plus whatever dead moonshiners were still up on the ridge. We were outnumbered and outgunned. But as we started to back away, Constance called out again. Billy, don't you want to see your grandfather? I froze. Behind Constance, another figure stepped out of the trees. It was an old man in overalls, but his skin was gray and there were mushrooms growing from his shoulders. Grandpa? I whispered. The thing that had been my grandfather looked at me with empty eye sockets. When it spoke, the voice was dry as autumn leaves. She kept her promise, Billy. Said she'd let me see you again when you were grown. This isn't you, I said. Grandpa would never help her hurt innocent people. Ain't hurt, boy. Just changed. Come join us. Make the family complete. Constance laughed. Such a touching reunion. But I'm afraid Billy has a choice to make. He can watch his new friends become ingredients, or he can take their place. What do you mean? I need someone with mountain blood for the final batch. Someone who understands the old ways. Your grandfather's been saving his essence for 10 years, waiting for you to join him. The thing that looked like my grandpa nodded. She's almost ready, Billy. 200 years of work, almost done. Help her finish, and we can be together forever. Collins was pulling on my arm again, trying to get me to eat. But I could see the federal agents starting to change. Their skin was getting paler, and their movements were becoming more wooden. Time was running out. I need to think about it, I said. Constance smiled. Of course, but don't take too long. The moon will be full in 3 hours. That's when the final distillation begins. She waved her hand, and suddenly the clearing was empty. No helicopter, no agents, no witch. Just me and Collins standing in a normal forest clearing. Did that really happen? Collins asked. I knelt down and found scuff marks in the dirt where the helicopter had crashed. It happened, but they're not here anymore. Where are they? I looked up at Devil's Backbone Ridge where the orange glow was getting brighter as the sun went down. They're at the still, and we've got 3 hours to figure out how to save them. Back at my truck, I pulled out my grandpa's journal again. There had to be something in there about fighting Constance, some way to stop her. Collins was trying her radio again, but all she got was that singing. It was getting louder as the sun went down. Found something, I said, reading from the journal. October 19th, 1967. Old Mary Crow says there's a way to fight Constance. Traditional Cherokee protection ritual, but it needs specific ingredients. White sage, blessed water, and iron from a broken heart. What does that mean? I kept reading. Iron from a broken heart means something made with love that was later destroyed. Mary says the iron remembers the love, and love is stronger than death magic. Do you have anything like that? I thought for a moment, then went to my toolbox. At the bottom, wrapped in an old cloth, was a small iron cross. My grandmother had made it for my grandpa when he went to war. After he disappeared, she'd thrown it against the wall so hard, it cracked. This might work, I said, holding up the broken cross. What about the other stuff? I had white sage in my emergency kit. I always carried some because of my Cherokee heritage. The blessed water was trickier, but there was an old church about 5 miles down the mountain. We need to hurry, I said, looking at the sky. The moon was rising, almost full. We drove to the church as fast as we dared on the winding mountain roads. The old pastor was locking up when we arrived. Reverend Hayes, I called out, I need your help. He turned around, squinting in the headlights. Billy Moonwater? What are you doing out here so late? I need holy water. and I need you not to ask questions." Reverend Hayes had known me since I was a kid. He'd also grown up hearing the old stories about Devil's Backbone. "This about what's happening up on the ridge?" he asked quietly. "You know? I've been seeing the glow for 3 nights now, and Mrs. Patterson says her late husband came knocking at her door yesterday, smelling like moonshine and asking her to come dancing. He unlocked the church and filled a mason jar with holy water from the baptismal font. Billy, whatever you're planning to do up there, be careful. Some doors shouldn't be opened." "I'm trying to close them," I said. By the time we got back to Devil's Backbone, the moon was full and bright. The singing was so loud we could hear it over the truck engine. But there was something else mixed in with the voices. Screaming. "The agents," Colin said. We grabbed our gear and hiked up the trail as fast as we could. The sweet smell was overwhelming now, making everything look like it was underwater. But I kept the iron cross in one hand and the holy water in the other, and that seemed to help clear my head. The clearing around the giant still was packed with figures. I counted at least 20 dead moonshiners, all working frantically to tend the fire and stir the mash. The 6 federal agents were tied to posts around the still, and they were screaming as their bodies slowly dissolved into liquid that flowed into collection jars. Constance stood on a platform above it all, conducting the operation like an orchestra. The thing that had been my grandfather was beside her, feeding wood into the fire. "The final batch," Constance called out when she saw us. 200 years in the making. When this moonshine is ready, I'll be able to change anyone into anything I want. I'll have power over life and death itself." "Let them go," I shouted. "They're already gone, Billy. But their essence will live forever in the most perfect moonshine ever created." I looked at the agents. Captain Rodriguez was still conscious, but his legs had already dissolved. He looked at me with desperate eyes. "Stop her," he whispered. That's when I noticed something. All the dead moonshiners were staying away from the fire. They were doing the work, but they wouldn't get too close to the flames. "Fire," I said to Collins. "They're afraid of fire." "But they're tending the fire under the still." "Not that fire. Look at the color." The flames under the still were green, like the glow from the moonshine, but normal fire was orange and yellow. I pulled out a lighter and lit a piece of cloth from my shirt. The orange flame made several of the dead moonshiners step back. "Holy fire," I said, remembering something from my grandpa's journal. "Fire blessed by the living." I dipped the burning cloth in the holy water. Instead of going out, the flame turned white and got brighter. Constance saw what I was doing. "Stop him!" she shrieked. The dead moonshiners started moving toward us, but they moved slowly, like they were walking through thick water. I threw the burning cloth at the nearest collection jar. When the holy fire hit the jar, there was a sound like breaking glass and screaming wind. The jar exploded, and one of the federal agents suddenly solidified again. His legs were back, and he was breathing. "The jars!" I yelled to Collins. "We have to break the jars!" She started shooting, but regular bullets just passed through the glass without breaking it. I lit another piece of cloth and threw it at a different jar. Another explosion. Another agent saved. But there were dozens of jars, and Constance was getting angry. "Enough!" she screamed. She raised her hands, and the dead moonshiners stopped being afraid of the fire. They rushed at us, moving fast now. That's when my grandfather spoke up. "Billy," he said in his dry, dead voice. "Catch." He threw something at me, an old mason jar filled with clear liquid. But this liquid wasn't glowing. It looked like regular moonshine. "What's this?" "Recipe I've been working on for 10 years, he said. "Insurance policy." I looked at the jar. There were words scratched into the glass in Cherokee. They translated roughly to witch killer. "How do I use it?" "Drink half. Pour the other half on the main still. And Billy, tell your grandma I'm sorry." Before I could ask what he meant, Constance figured out what was happening. "Traitor!" she shrieked at my grandfather. "Ain't betrayal," he said calmly. "Just finishing what I should have done 10 years ago." The dead moonshiners reached us. Collins was fighting them off with a burning branch, but there were too many. I drank half the moonshine in the jar. It burned going down, but not like regular moonshine. This felt like swallowing lightning. Suddenly, I could see everything clearly. The dead moonshiners looked like what they really were, rotting corpses held together by Constance's will. The green fire looked sickly and wrong, and Constance herself. Constance wasn't a person anymore. She was a hole in the world, shaped like a woman, filled with hunger and hate that was 2 centuries old. I ran toward the main still, dodging grabbing hands and snapping teeth. When I reached it, I poured the rest of the moonshine onto the green flames. The fire turned white, then blue, then a color that doesn't have a name. The giant still started shaking, then cracking. All around the clearing, the collection jars began exploding. On their own, releasing streams of light that flew back to the federal agents. Constance screamed, and the sound broke windows in houses 5 miles away. "You don't understand," she shrieked. "I was so close. 200 years of work." "Some work shouldn't be finished," I said. The still collapsed with a crash that shook the mountain. All the dead moonshiners crumbled to dust, including the thing that had been my grandfather. But before he fell apart completely, he looked at me one last time. "Tell her I kept my promise," he said. "Kept you safe." Then he was gone, and so was Constance. Not destroyed. I could feel that she wasn't destroyed, but sent away. Back to whatever place she'd been waiting in for 200 years. The federal agents were all alive, but they didn't remember much. Captain Rodriguez said the last thing he recalled clearly was landing the helicopter. Everything after that was like a bad dream that faded in daylight. Agent Collins and I agreed to keep the supernatural details out of our reports. Officially, the agents had been drugged by fumes from an illegal methanol operation that exploded during the raid. The missing moonshiners were listed as casualties of the explosion. But I kept my grandfather's journal, and I started keeping my own. 3 months later, ATF agents found glowing moonshine in a raid near Asheville. The local sheriff said the moonshine maker had been acting strange for weeks, talking to people who weren't there. 6 months after that, a park ranger in Tennessee reported finding a still that operated by itself with no one tending it. When they got close enough to investigate, the still vanished. Last month, Collins called me from Virginia. She'd found another missing persons case that matched our pattern. An old woman making moonshine, people disappearing, strange lights in the woods. "I think she's rebuilding," Collins said. "Starting over somewhere else." I wasn't surprised. Constance McBride had waited 200 years to finish her work. Being stopped once wouldn't be enough to make her give up. That is why I keep my grandfather's recipe handy. That's why I patrol Devil's Backbone every full moon, looking for signs of green fire or hearing Gaelic singing in the wind. And that's why I've started teaching other park rangers about the old stories. Because the government doesn't believe in witches, but witches definitely believe in the government. And they're always looking for new ingredients. Last week I found fresh moonshine on Devil's Backbone. It wasn't glowing yet, but it smelled wrong. Too sweet. Too much like flowers and death. I poured it out and left a note where I found it, written in Cherokee. Still watching. Still ready. The next night the moonshine was gone, and so was my note. In its place was a message scratched into the bark of a dead tree. Soon. So I keep watching. I keep the blessed moonshine ready. And I keep my grandfather's promise to protect these mountains from the things that shouldn't exist. Because up on Devil's Backbone, in the shadows between the living world and the dead one, Constance McBride is still making moonshine. And she's still got 200 years of work to finish. The only question is whether I'll be strong enough to stop her when she tries again. My name is Marcus Coleridge, but everyone calls me Mark. I've been a park ranger at Jefferson National Forest for 16 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything these mountains could throw at me. Lost hikers, bear attacks, illegal hunting, you name it. But what happened at Coal Creek in October of 1978 changed everything I thought I knew about this world. I grew up in these hills. My daddy worked the mines, and his daddy before him. The Coleridge family had been pulling coal out of these mountains for 3 generations. That all ended when I was 12 and the Black Rock mine collapsed on top of my father. 23 men went down that day. Only 20 came back up. After high school, I couldn't bring myself to go underground. The thought of all that rock hanging over my head made my chest tight. So I became a ranger instead. At least out here, I could see the sky. That October was turning cold early. The leaves had already dropped and fog rolled through the hollows every morning like ghostly fingers. I'd been working Coal Creek Hollow for the past 5 years, ever since they closed it to mining operations. The old Coal Creek mine had been sealed up tight since 1952, the year it killed my father. The company houses were still there, empty and falling apart. Rusty mining equipment sat scattered around like metal bones. Most folks stayed away from Coal Creek. Too many bad memories. Too many stories about strange things happening in the dark. I never believed the old-timers' stories about hollow men walking the dead mines. Figured it was just mountain talk, the kind of ghost stories that keep kids from playing where they shouldn't. I was wrong about that. Dead wrong. It was a Tuesday morning when the call came in. 3 people missing. College folks from Virginia Tech studying the old mining sites. Dr. Patricia Hayes, a geology professor, and 2 graduate students, Nos, Ahmed Todd Morrison and Angela Kim. They'd been gone for 2 days. The dispatcher told me their last known location was the Coal Creek mine entrance. They were taking soil samples for some kind of environmental study. Made sense, I guess. The government had been talking about cleaning up all these old mining sites. I loaded my truck with emergency gear and headed up the hollow. The road was more like a dirt path, winding between the hills like a snake. My CB radio started acting up about halfway there, picking up old mining songs from the 50s. I figured it was just atmospheric interference. The mountains could do strange things to radio waves. When I reached their campsite, I found their tents still set up, but nobody home. Geological equipment was scattered everywhere. Rock hammers, sample bags, measuring tools. It looked like they'd dropped everything and walked away in the middle of working. The strange part was the digging. Someone had been working around the mine entrance with shovels, maybe pickaxes. The concrete seal that had kept that mine closed for 26 years was cracked wide open. The steel bars were bent outward, like something had pushed them from the inside. I called it in on my radio, but all I got back was static and what sounded like men singing work songs. Old mining songs my grandfather used to hum, the kind they sang to keep time with their pickaxes. The smell hit me next. Coal dust and methane gas, sharp and bitter in the cold air. But that mine had been sealed since before I was born. There shouldn't have been any smell at all. I pulled out my flashlight and stepped closer to the entrance. The beam disappeared into the darkness like it was being swallowed up. And I swear I heard something down there, the distant sound of metal on rock like someone was still working deep underground. That's when I noticed the temperature drop. My breath started showing white, even though it was a mild October day. The cold seemed to be coming right out of that mine shaft, carrying with it the smell of things that had been buried too long. Should have waited for backup. Should have called the state police and let them handle it. But 3 people were missing, and I was the only one who knew these mountains well enough to find them in the dark. I took one more look at that cracked concrete, those bent steel bars, and made the biggest mistake of my life. I went inside. The mine entrance was bigger than I expected. The concrete seal had cracked in a perfect circle, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. My flashlight beam showed old railroad tracks disappearing into the darkness. The wooden support beams looked solid enough, but 26 years underground had turned them black with rot. The temperature kept dropping as I went deeper. Soon, I could see my breath with every step. The walls were covered in a fine layer of coal dust that shouldn't have been there. When I touched it, the dust was warm, like it had just been disturbed by passing miners. About 50 feet in, I found the first sign of the missing people. Dr. Hayes' field notebook dropped open on the ground. Her handwriting was neat and careful on the first few pages, documenting soil samples and geological formations. But the last entry was different. The writing got shaky, desperate. "Something wrong here. Todd says he hears singing. Angela found fresh coal dust. Impossible. Mine sealed since 1952. Getting cold. Getting very cold. Can't shake feeling we're being watched. The entry ended mid-sentence, like she'd dropped the notebook and run. I followed the old railroad tracks deeper into the mine. The singing was getting clearer now, men's voices echoing off the stone walls. But the words were all wrong. They were singing about work that never ended, about darkness that went on forever. My compass started spinning wildly, the needle pointing in all directions like it couldn't find north. The air tasted metallic, like blood mixed with coal dust. And the smell was getting stronger. Not just methane and mineral, but something else. Something that reminded me of meat left too long in the sun. That's when I found Dr. Hayes. She was sitting upright against the tunnel wall, her back straight like she was taking a rest break. Her field equipment was arranged neatly beside her. At first glance, she looked like she was sleeping. But when my flashlight hit her face, I knew she was dead. Her skin was gray as coal dust. Her lips were black, and black powder covered her chin where it had leaked from her mouth. But the worst part was her expression. She looked peaceful, almost happy, like dying had been a relief. I checked for a pulse anyway. Her skin was ice cold, but she hadn't been dead long. Maybe an hour, maybe less. And when I listened close, I could hear something that made my blood freeze. She was still breathing, slow, shallow breaths that whistled through lungs full of coal dust. I tried my radio again, but all I got was more of that singing. The voices were closer now, coming from deeper in the mine, and I was pretty sure I heard Todd Morrison's voice mixed in with the others. That's when the temperature really dropped. It went from cold to freezing in about 10 seconds. My flashlight beam started dimming, like the cold was draining the batteries. And somewhere in the darkness ahead, I heard the sound of a pickaxe hitting rock. I left Dr. Hayes where she was. I had to find the other two while there was still time. The tunnel split into two branches up ahead. I chose the left one because that's where the singing was coming from. The left tunnel sloped downward, following what used to be a coal seam. The support beams were closer together here, and some of them were cracked. More than once I heard the mountain groaning overhead, like it was getting ready to cave in. About 100 feet down, I found Todd Morrison. He was standing in a side chamber, his back to me, working with a pickaxe. The sound echoed through the tunnels, metal on rock, steady as a heartbeat. He was still wearing his college clothes, but they were covered in coal dust and torn in places. "Todd!" I called out. "Todd Morrison!" He didn't turn around, didn't stop working, just kept swinging that pickaxe like his life depended on it. When I got closer, I could see what he was digging. A new tunnel, cutting straight into solid rock. His hands were torn up and bleeding, but he didn't seem to notice. I put my hand on his shoulder and spun him around. What I saw made me step back fast. His eyes were completely black, not just the pupils, but the whole eye. Black as coal, black as the deep spaces between stars. His skin had that same gray color as Dr. Hayes, and coal dust leaked from the corners of his mouth when he tried to speak. But the worst part was that he was still Todd Morrison. I could see the scared college kid underneath all that wrongness. He was trapped inside his own body, watching himself dig a tunnel he didn't understand. "Can't stop," he whispered, his voice rough with coal dust. "Gotta keep working, gotta finish the job. Iron Jake says we're behind schedule." Then he turned back to his digging, and I noticed the pickaxe he was using. It was old, the kind they used in the 50s. The wooden handle was worn smooth by decades of use, and carved into the metal head were the initials J.M. Jacob Mackenzie, Iron Jake, the foreman who died in the 1952 disaster. I tried to grab Todd's arm to pull him away from the tunnel wall, but he was stronger than any college student had a right to be. Strong enough to shake me off without even looking back. That's when I heard Angela scream. The sound came from somewhere deeper in the mine, echoing off the walls until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was a sound of pure terror, the kind of scream that comes when someone realizes they're going to die. I ran toward the sound, leaving Todd to his digging. My flashlight was getting dimmer, and the singing was getting louder. More voices now, at least a dozen, maybe more. And underneath the singing, I could hear the sound of shovels and pickaxes, like a whole crew was working somewhere in the darkness. The tunnel branched again and again. This mine was bigger than I'd thought, with passages running in all directions like the inside of an anthill. Some of them had been sealed off with rock falls, but others stretched away into blackness. I found Angela Kim at the bottom of a vertical shaft. She'd fallen about 20 feet, landing hard on a pile of loose rock. But she hadn't fallen by accident. The rock pile was arranged too neat, too purposeful. Someone had been digging here, removing stones one by one, building that pile like steps. Angela was still alive when I reached her, but barely. Her fingernails were torn off, and her hands were bloody from clawing at solid rock. She kept mumbling about needing to dig deeper, about finishing the job before Iron Jake got angry. "The hollow men," she whispered when she saw my light. "They're not dead. They're just empty. And they want us to be empty too." Then she stopped breathing, her eyes going black as coal dust spilled from her mouth. I was alone in the dark with 3 dead college students and the sound of impossible mining work echoing through tunnels that had been sealed for 26 years. And somewhere in that darkness, Iron Jake Mackenzie was getting ready to put me to work. I should have run right then. Should have climbed out of that mine and called for every available backup unit in 3 counties. But something was wrong with my thinking. The deeper I went, the harder it became to remember why I wanted to leave. The singing was getting inside my head, making my thoughts fuzzy. Part of me kept thinking that maybe I should pick up a shovel, help out with whatever work needed doing. After all, the Coleridge family had always been hard workers. Maybe it was time to join the family business. I forced myself to focus on getting out, but when I tried to retrace my steps, all the tunnels looked the same. The railroad tracks branched and split like a spider web. My compass was useless, spinning in circles, and my flashlight was dimming fast. That's when I heard footsteps coming toward me through the darkness, heavy boots on rock, moving with the steady rhythm of men who knew exactly where they were going. The footsteps were accompanied by the jingle of metal, lunch pails maybe, or tools hanging from work belts. I switched off my flashlight and pressed myself against the tunnel wall. The footsteps got closer, and I started to see a dim glow coming from around the bend. Not electric light, more like the orange flicker of carbide lamps. The first miner came around the corner and my heart nearly stopped. He was wearing clothes from the 50s, dungarees and a flannel shirt, a hard hat with a carbide lamp attached to the front. His lunch pail swung from his belt as he walked, but he was see-through, like fog shaped into the form of a man. I could see the tunnel wall right through his chest. Behind him came another miner, then another, a whole crew of dead men walking to work, carrying their tools and singing their work songs. They passed right by me without looking, their ghostly forms flickering in the carbide light. The last man in line stopped. He was bigger than the others, with broad shoulders and arms like tree trunks. His hard hat had "Foreman" written across the front in white letters, and his carbide lamp burned brighter than the rest. When he turned to look at me, I saw a face I recognized from old newspaper photos. Jacob, Iron Jake Mackenzie, the man who'd died trying to save his crew in 1952. "Marcus Coleridge," he said, and his voice sounded like rocks grinding together. "Third generation. Your granddaddy was a good worker. Your daddy too, before the mountain took him. Time you joined the family business." I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Iron Jake's eyes were like black holes, pulling at something deep inside me. The other miners had stopped walking and turned to watch. "We got work to do," Iron Jake continued. "Been working for 26 years, digging new tunnels, expanding the mine. But we need fresh blood, living hands to hold the tools." He gestured, and one of the ghostly miners stepped forward with a pickaxe. The tool looked real enough, solid and heavy. When the ghost dropped it, the pickaxe hit the ground with a loud clang. "Your college friends are already helping out," Iron Jake said. "Good workers, all of them. They'll work until their bodies give out, then they'll join us permanently, just like you will." I found my voice. "They're dead." "Not dead," Iron Jake corrected. "Recruited. There's a difference. Dead men can't swing a pickaxe, But recruited men, they can work forever. The singing started up again, louder now. All the ghostly miners joined in, their voices echoing through the tunnels. And somewhere in that chorus, I heard Todd Morrison's voice, still struggling to sing along. My radio crackled to life. Through the static, I heard Susan Caldwell's voice calling my name. Susan was my backup, scheduled to check on me if I didn't report in by evening. She must have followed my trail to the mine. Mark? Mark, where are you? I found the missing hiker's campsite. Something's wrong here. The mine entrance is... Oh God, what happened to this concrete? Iron Jake smiled, showing teeth like broken coal. More recruits. We'll have a full crew soon. I managed to break free from whatever was holding me and ran toward the entrance. Behind me, I heard the sound of pickaxes hitting rock as the ghost miners went back to work. But now there were more tools, shovels and hammers, and the wet sound of bare hands digging through stone. I found Susan at the mine entrance, staring at the cracked concrete with wide eyes. Her radio was in her hand, but all that came out of it was mining songs. Susan! I grabbed her shoulder. We need to get out of here, now. But it was too late. The cold was already getting to her. I could see her breath, and her eyes were starting to go glassy. When she looked at me, I saw the same expression I'd seen on Todd Morrison's face, like she was already somewhere else. The rock is calling, she said in a dreamy voice. Can you hear it, Mark? It wants us to dig. It wants us to find what's buried down there. She dropped her radio and walked back into the mine. I tried to stop her, but she pushed past me with strength I didn't know she had. By the time I caught up, she was already kneeling in the dirt, digging with her bare hands. Susan, stop! Look at me! She kept digging, her fingernails breaking against the stone. Gotta work, she muttered. Iron Jake says we're behind schedule. Gotta catch up. I watched her dig until her fingers started bleeding. Then I heard more footsteps coming up the tunnel. Todd Morrison appeared in my flashlight beam, still carrying his pickaxe. Behind him came Dr. Hayes, walking with the jerky movements of someone who wasn't quite alive anymore. And behind them, the ghost miners, their carbide lamps flickering in the darkness. Welcome to the crew, Iron Jake's voice echoed from somewhere deeper in the mine. We got plenty of work for everyone. Susan looked up at me with eyes that were starting to turn black. Coal dust was already gathering at the corners of her mouth. Join us, Mark, she said. It's easy. You just have to stop fighting and let the mountain take you. The ghost miners were getting closer. I could hear their boots on the railroad tracks, their tools clanging against the tunnel walls. And mixed in with their ghostly forms, I saw the college students, Todd and Dr. Hayes and Angela Kim, all of them carrying mining tools, all of them ready to work until they died. I was outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped in a mine with 23 dead miners and their growing crews, who of recruits. The only thing I had going for me was that I knew these mountains better than anyone alive. And I remembered something my grandfather had taught me. Something about the old mining blessing that was supposed to protect workers from cave-ins and gas explosions. Something about the power of words spoken in darkness. It was time to find out if the old ways still worked. The ghost miners were closing in from both sides now. Iron Jake's crew coming from the depths of the mine and Susan blocking my way to the entrance. The living recruits moved like sleepwalkers, their eyes black as coal, but the dead miners moved with purpose. They knew exactly what they were doing. You can't fight all of us. Iron Jake's voice boomed from the darkness. And why would you want to? Your family's been mining these hills for generations. This is where you belong. I backed against the tunnel wall, trying to remember my grandfather's exact words. He'd taught me the old mining blessing when I was just a kid, said it was something passed down from the Welsh miners who first worked these mountains. Words of protection for men who spent their lives underground. But first, I had to understand what I was fighting. Why? I called out to Iron Jake. Why can't you just rest? The mine's been closed for 26 years. The ghost foreman materialized in front of me, his carbide lamp casting crazy shadows on the tunnel walls. Rest? He laughed, a sound like rocks falling. You think we chose this? You think we want to spend eternity digging coal? Then why? Because we died with work unfinished. Iron Jake's form flickered with anger. The company pushed us too hard, cut too many corners. We were pulling double shifts, working seams that should have been left alone. When the mountain came down, we were trying to prop up a tunnel that never should have been dug. The other ghost miners began to appear around him, their faces gaunt with exhaustion, even in death. I recognized some of them from old newspaper photos, young men who'd left wives and children behind. We died, doing someone else's dirty work, Iron Jake continued. And now we're bound to keep working until we find others to take our place, living hands to finish what we started. That's the curse of dying with unfinished business. Susan was still digging at my feet, her fingernails torn and bleeding. Todd Morrison shambled closer, his pickaxe raised, and Dr. Hayes stood in the entrance tunnel, blocking my escape route. You take our place, Iron Jake said, and we get to rest. Simple as that. That's when I understood. These weren't evil spirits trying to hurt people. They were trapped souls trying to escape the only way they knew how. But that didn't make them any less dangerous. I took a deep breath and spoke the words my grandfather had taught me. By iron and coal, by stone and flame, I call upon the mountain's name. Protect the living, guard the breath, stand between the quick and death. The effect was immediate. The ghost miners flickered and stepped back like I'd hit them with a physical blow. Iron Jake's form became less solid, more like smoke than man. Old words, he said, his voice fading. Your grandfather knew the old words, but they won't hold us for long. He was right. I could feel the blessing's power weakening already. It was meant to protect one man for one shift, not to fight off 23 vengeful spirits. But it bought me enough time to think. I needed to get Susan and the others away from this place, but I also needed to make sure the ghost miners couldn't recruit anyone else. The mine entrance had to be sealed permanently. I had 1 stick of dynamite in my emergency kit, standard equipment for clearing rock slides. Not much, but maybe enough to bring down the main support beam near the entrance. If I could cause a cave-in in the right place, it might seal the mine for good. The problem was timing. I needed to get Susan and the living recruits out first. I grabbed Susan by the shoulders and shook her hard. Susan, look at me! Remember who you are! For just a moment, her eyes cleared. The black faded to brown, and I saw the real Susan Caldwell underneath. Mark? What's happening? Why are my hands bleeding? No time to explain. We need to get out of here right now. But the moment was brief. The blackness crept back into her eyes, and she tried to return to her digging. I had to half carry, half drag her toward the entrance. Todd Morrison blocked our path, but he moved slowly like he was fighting the compulsion. I could see the real Todd still trapped inside, struggling against Iron Jake's influence. The living fight harder, Iron Jake observed, but they always give in eventually. The mountain is patient. I was running out of time and options. The ghost miners were regaining their strength, and my protection blessing was fading fast. I could feel their presence pressing against my mind, whispering about how easy it would be to just pick up a shovel and join the work. That's when I heard engines outside. Truck engines getting closer. Backup was finally arriving, probably the state police, responding to reports of missing hikers. More recruits, Iron Jake said with satisfaction. We'll have a full crew by morning. I made my decision. I couldn't save everyone, but I could stop this from spreading. I pulled out my dynamite and timer, set it for 30 seconds, and wedged it against the main support beam. You're going to bury yourself alive, Iron Jake warned. Maybe, I said, but I'm taking you with me. I lit the fuse and ran, dragging Susan behind me. Todd Morrison tried to grab us, but the remaining blessing gave me just enough strength to push past him. Behind us, I heard Iron Jake shouting orders to his ghost crew. The entrance was 20 feet away when the dynamite went off. The explosion, wasn't huge, but it was perfectly placed. The main support beam cracked and twisted, and suddenly the ceiling started coming down. Tons of rock and earth crashed into the tunnel, sealing the entrance permanently. I threw myself over Susan just as a chunk of limestone hit the ground where we'd been standing. The dust cloud was so thick I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. For a moment, I thought we'd both been buried alive. Then I felt fresh air on my face. We were outside, lying in the dirt next to the sealed mine entrance. My ears were ringing from the explosion, and my mouth was full of dust, but we were alive. The ghost miners' voices had been cut off, trapped behind tons of fallen rock. Susan coughed and sat up, her eyes clear for the first time since entering the mine. "Mark? What happened? Where are the missing hikers?" I helped her to her feet and looked back at what was left of the Coal Creek mine entrance. Where there had been a hole in the concrete, now there was only a pile of rubble 30 feet high. The state police were just arriving, their vehicles kicking up dust clouds as they drove up the hollow. I would have to explain about the missing hikers, about Susan's injuries, about why I'd blown up a sealed mine entrance. But I wouldn't tell them about the hollow men. Some stories are too dangerous to share. The official report blamed the deaths on methane gas poisoning from the old mine. 3 Virginia Tech researchers dead, 1 park ranger hospitalized with exposure symptoms, and a mine entrance permanently sealed due to structural instability. The state quarantined Coal Creek Hollow indefinitely and posted warning signs throughout the area. Susan spent 3 days in the hospital with severe dehydration and cuts on her hands that she couldn't explain. The doctors said she was lucky. Whatever had happened in that mine, she'd escaped with her life. She transferred to a different district 2 weeks later, said she needed a change of scenery. I stayed on as a ranger for 6 more months, long enough to make sure the mine stayed sealed. But every night I could hear singing coming from the hills around Coal Creek. Work songs from the 1950s, carried on the mountain wind. Sometimes I'd find fresh coal dust on my truck in the morning, even though there were no active mines for 50 miles. The custody hearing went better than expected. My ex-wife's lawyer tried to make a big deal about me being involved in a mining accident, but the judge saw through that. Joint custody was granted. My kids would spend weekends with me, and I was determined to make sure they grew up far away from these mountains. We moved to Roanoke that fall. I got a job with the city parks department. Nothing glamorous, but honest work under open sky. My children adapted well to city life. They've never asked why we left the mountains, and I've never told them. But sometimes, late at night, I get phone calls from other rangers working the Jefferson National Forest. They tell me about hikers who go missing near old mine sites, about fresh digging around sealed entrances, about the sound of pickaxes echoing through empty tunnels. I always tell them the same thing: stay out of the deep places. Don't investigate alone. And if you hear singing in a dead mine, run. The old-timers in these mountains know the truth, even if they won't say it out loud. Some jobs never get finished, some workers never get to rest, and sometimes the mountain itself becomes part of the trap, holding on to souls that died with unfinished business. Coal Creek Hollow is still quarantined. The warning signs have faded over the years, and the access road is grown over with weeds, but the mine stays sealed, and that's what matters. As long as those tons of rock stay in place, Iron Jake McKenzie and his crew will stay buried. But rocks can shift. Water can wash away even the heaviest stones. And every now and then, some fool with a metal detector or a geology degree gets curious about the old mining sites. That's why I keep my phone number listed in the Ranger Station directory. That's why I tell my story to anyone who'll listen, even knowing they think I'm crazy. Because somewhere in the dark places under these mountains, the hollow men are still working, and they're always looking for new recruits. If you ever find yourself in the mountains of West Virginia, and you hear singing coming from a sealed mine, remember Marcus Coleridge's story. Remember that some doors should never be opened, and some work should never be finished. The dead have all eternity to be patient, but the living only get one chance to walk away. My name is Jimmy Bloodworth, and I've been a park ranger in Daniel Boone National Forest for 13 years now. Before that, I was a medic in Vietnam. I came back from the war wanting to help people instead of watching them die. The mountains of Kentucky felt like the perfect place to start over. I always figured the stories about night doctors were just old mountain tales. You know how it is around here. Folks have been scared of outside doctors for generations. Can't blame them, really. Back in the 1940s, government doctors did some pretty awful things to families in these hills. Experiments nobody talks about anymore. It was August 1972 when everything started going wrong. The heat that summer was like a wet blanket you couldn't shake off. Thunderstorms rolled through every few days, making the air thick and electric. Even the animals seemed nervous. Panther Creek sits about 18 miles from the nearest hospital. It's where some of the old mountain families still live, way back in the hollows where the government doctors used to come calling. There's an old building back there, too. What's left of some kind of research place from the war years. Most folks stay clear of it. I'd been hearing complaints about strange smells coming from that direction. Families saying their hunting dogs wouldn't go near the old building anymore. Even the insects seemed to be dying off around there. But you know how people talk in small towns. I didn't pay it much mind. Then Earl Whitaker came to see me. Earl's a good man, works hard, takes care of his family. His grandfather Josiah still lives with them, along with Earl's wife Dolly and their 4 kids. When Earl showed up at my station that morning, he looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Ranger Bloodworth," he said, "we got a problem up at the house, a big one." He told me his kids had been playing near that old research building 2 weeks back. Found some doctor toys, old surgical tools, he said. Brought them home before anyone could stop them. That's when people started getting sick. "What kind of sick?" I asked. Earl rubbed his face with both hands. "The kind that ain't supposed to exist no more. Little Mary's got something that looks like polio. My oldest boy's coughing up blood like he's got the consumption. And Grandpa Josiah, Lord help us, he's showing signs of the plague." Now, I'd seen enough in the war to know when someone was making things up. Earl wasn't lying. The fear in his eyes was real as rain. "You called a doctor?" I asked. "Tried to. Doc Patterson won't come up here, says it ain't safe. But Ranger, these ain't normal sicknesses. They came on too fast, hit too hard, and there's something else." He leaned forward, lowering his voice like someone might be listening. "That old building's making noises at night. Sounds like medical equipment running. But there ain't been power to that place in 30 years. I told Earl I'd drive up there that afternoon to take a look. As he left, I noticed he kept glancing over his shoulder, like something was following him. The drive to Panther Creek takes you through some of the prettiest country in Kentucky. Rolling hills covered in oak and pine, little streams bubbling over limestone rocks. But that day, something felt off. The usual birdsong was missing. Even with my windows down, the forest seemed too quiet. When I pulled up to the Whitaker place, I could see what Earl meant about his family being sick. Dolly was sitting on the porch, fanning herself with a piece of cardboard. She looked pale and thin, like she'd lost 20 pounds in 2 weeks. "Afternoon, Mrs. Whitaker," I called out. "How are you folks doing?" She tried to smile, but I could see the worry lines around her eyes. "Been better, Ranger." Earl's inside with, "The children, they're not doing so good." The smell hit me as soon as I walked through the front door. It was like being in a hospital, that sharp, clean smell of antiseptic and medicine. But underneath it was something else, something that reminded me of the field hospitals in Vietnam. Earl met me in the hallway. "They're in the back bedroom," he said quietly. "I should warn you, they look pretty bad." Nothing could have prepared me for what I saw in that room. 4 children lay in 2 beds, and every one of them looked like they were dying from a different disease. The youngest girl, Mary, had that twisted look you see in old pictures of polio victims. Her legs were thin and bent at wrong angles. The oldest boy was coughing constantly, bringing up blood with each breath. The other 2 kids had fever spots covering their skin and were mumbling in their sleep. But here's the thing that made my skin crawl. They all smelled like ether, like they'd been in surgery. "When did this start?" I asked Earl. "Right after they played with those old doctor tools. Found them scattered around that building like someone had just been using them." I looked closer at the children and felt my stomach turn. Each of them had small, neat scars on their bodies, fresh ones, like someone had been cutting them with surgical precision. "Earl," I said carefully, "have you taken these kids to see anyone? Any doctor or nurse?" He shook his head. "Only doctor that would come was old Doc Blackthorne, and he's been dead for 20 years. That's when I knew we weren't dealing with anything normal. I stayed at the Whitaker house until sunset, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Earl showed me the surgical tools his kids had found. Old steel instruments with bone handles, the kind they might have used in the 1940s. They were clean as a whistle, but there were tiny spots of fresh blood on the blades. "You sure these were just lying around?" I asked. "Scattered on the ground near the old building like someone dropped them," Earl said. "But here's the strange part." "What?" And I went back the next day to see where they came from. There were more. More tools? No, sir, more blood. Fresh blood, like someone had been operating right there on the ground. As darkness fell, Earl offered to let me stay the night. Said it wasn't safe to drive back alone after dark. I was about to ask him what he meant when we heard it. The sound was coming from deep in the woods, maybe half a mile away. It sounded exactly like what Earl had described. Medical equipment humming to life. An X-ray machine warming up. The whir of some kind of surgical saw. "There it is," Earl whispered. "Starts up every night around this time." I grabbed my flashlight and headed for the door. "I'm going to check it out." "Don't." Earl caught my arm. "Please, Ranger. Whatever's out there, it ain't natural." But I had to see for myself. That's just who I am. Can't leave a mystery unsolved. The walk through the woods to the old research building was the longest half-mile of my life. My flashlight beam kept catching things that shouldn't have been there. Reflections off metal that disappeared when I looked directly at them. Footprints in the mud that looked like they came from surgical boots. And that smell was getting stronger. Ether and formaldehyde, mixed with something sweet and rotten. The research building sat in a little hollow, surrounded by dead trees. It was just a concrete block structure, maybe 30 feet square, with no windows and one rusty metal door. But light was leaking out from under that door, and I could hear voices inside. I crept closer and pressed my ear to the wall. "Patient presence with advanced tuberculosis," a man's voice was saying. "We'll need to remove the affected lung tissue for examination." Another voice, a woman this time. "Doctor, the patient is still conscious." "Excellent. We'll get better responses to our questions that way." My blood went cold. I knew that first voice. It belonged to Doc Blackthorne, and Earl was right. He'd been dead for 20 years. I'd been to his funeral myself. I tried the door handle. It turned, easily, like it was waiting for me. The inside of that building was impossible. It should have been empty concrete rooms, filled with rust and decay. Instead, it looked like a fully operating surgical suite from the 1940s. White tile walls, bright lights hanging from the ceiling, steel tables with leather straps, and standing over one of those tables was Dr. Cornelius Blackthorne. He looked exactly like I remembered him. Tall, thin, with wire-rimmed glasses and perfectly combed gray hair. The only difference was his skin, which had the waxy, pale look of something that had been dead for a long time. On the table in front of him was little Mary Whitaker. She was awake, looking around with frightened eyes. Her chest had been opened up neat as you please, and Doc Blackthorne was rearranging her internal organs like he was organizing a toolbox. "Ah, Ranger Bloodworth," he said without looking up. "Right on time. Would you like to observe? I'm conducting a fascinating study on how the human body adapts to impossible diseases." I tried to speak, but nothing came out. This couldn't be real. "You see," Doc Blackthorne continued, holding up what looked like Mary's heart. "The government research we conducted here in the 1940s was just the beginning. Death has given me so much more freedom to explore the limits of human endurance." Mary tried to say something, but only blood came out of her mouth. "The child will survive this procedure," the doctor said. "They always do. That's the beauty of my new methods. I can keep them alive through anything." I found my voice. "Let her go." Doc Blackthorne finally looked at me, and his eyes were completely black. "Oh, Ranger, I'm afraid that's not possible. You see, the Whitaker family participated in our original research. Their children are genetically predisposed to accept my improvements." That's when I saw the nurses. 3 women in old-fashioned white uniforms were moving around the room, preparing instruments and monitoring equipment. Their faces were gray and sunken, like they'd been underwater for a long time. My staff, Doc Blackthorne said proudly. They volunteered to continue their work beyond death. Dedicated professionals. One of the nurses looked up at me and smiled. Half her face was missing. I ran. I sprinted through those woods faster than I'd run since Vietnam. Branches tearing at my clothes, my flashlight beam jumping all over the place. Behind me, I could hear Doc Blackthorne calling out in a cheerful voice, "Don't worry, Ranger. Your turn will come soon enough." When I burst through the door of the Whitaker house, Earl and Dolly were waiting for me. They took one look at my face and knew. "You saw him," Earl said. I nodded, trying to catch my breath. "Mary, is Mary in her room?" Dolly started crying. "She disappeared about an hour ago, right out of her bed." That's when we heard the screaming start. The screaming was coming from the woods, high and thin like a child in terrible pain. Earl grabbed his shotgun and we ran toward the sound, following it back toward that cursed building. We found Mary about halfway there, lying on the ground in a little clearing. She was alive, but barely. The surgical cuts on her chest had been sewn up with perfect, tiny stitches. But something was wrong with her eyes. They were wide open and completely white. "Mary, honey," Dolly whispered, kneeling beside her daughter. "Can you hear me?" Mary's head turned toward her mother, but she spoke in a man's voice, Doc Blackthorne's voice. "The procedure was a complete success," she said. "The patient now has full knowledge of advanced surgical techniques. She'll make an excellent assistant." Earl pointed his shotgun at his own daughter. "That ain't Mary anymore." But then Mary blinked, and her Norm, Al's voice came back. "Mama, what happened to me? Why does my chest hurt so bad?" We carried her back to the house, but I could see it was too late. Whatever Doc Blackthorne had done to her was spreading. By morning, Mary was talking about surgical procedures she'd never heard of, using medical words no 5-year-old should know. And the sickness was spreading to other families, too. The Hatfield place, about 2 miles down the creek, reported that their teenage twins Jenny and Mark had come down with something that looked like leprosy. The McCoy family found their elderly parents, Homer and Bessie, suffering from what appeared to be experimental drug reactions. Their skin was turning different colors, and they were speaking in foreign languages. Most disturbing was what happened to the local preacher, Reverend Stone. Someone found him in his church that morning, standing at the pulpit, preaching a sermon about the medical benefits of human experimentation. His congregation was sitting in the pews, but they were all dead. Had been for hours, from the look of them. When folks tried to approach Reverend Stone, he started describing surgical procedures in perfect medical detail. Then he collapsed, and when they rolled him over, they found surgical scars all over his back. I radioed for help, but the static on my radio sounded like surgical equipment running. Every time I tried to call out, I heard Doc Blackthorne's voice coming through. "No outside assistance required, Ranger. We have everything well in hand." That afternoon, Earl came to me with the worst news yet. "It's Dolly," he said, tears streaming down his face. "She's got it now, too." When I got to their house, Dolly was in the kitchen, calmly preparing dinner. But she had 6 different diseases at once, things that should have killed her instantly. Her skin showed signs of advanced smallpox, her breathing suggested pneumonia, and her hands shook like she had advanced Parkinson's disease. But she was still cooking, humming quietly to herself. "Evening, Ranger," she said without turning around. "Would you like some supper? I'm preparing a meal based on the nutritional requirements for post-operative patients." Earl grabbed my arm. "She's been like this for hours, talking about medical procedures, but still acting like herself. It's like there's 2 people in there." That's when I understood what Doc Blackthorne was really doing. He wasn't just making people sick. He was turning them into his staff, using their bodies as hosts while keeping their minds trapped inside, watching everything but unable to stop it. As darkness fell, the sounds from the forest got louder. Not just the surgical equipment anymore, but voices. Lots of voices, all speaking in medical terminology. "Sounds like he's got quite a staff built up," Earl said grimly. I looked out the window toward the forest and saw lights moving between the trees. Dozens of them, like people carrying lanterns. "Earl," I said, How many families live in these hollows? He thought for a moment. Maybe 15, 20 families. Why? The lights were getting closer, and now I could see they weren't lanterns at all. They were the kind of surgical lights doctors wear on their heads, and they were all heading straight for the Whitaker house. Because I think Doc Blackthorne is making house calls tonight. The first figure emerged from the tree line just as Earl was loading his shotgun. It was Homer McCoy, the old man from down the creek. But he was walking perfectly upright despite being 80 years old, and his eyes glowed with that same surgical light. "Good evening," Homer said in Doc Blackthorne's voice. "We've come to collect the remaining members of the family for their procedures." Behind him came more figures, neighbors, friends, people Earl had known his whole life, but they all moved with the same strange, purposeful walk, and they all had surgical scars covering their bodies. "What do you want?" Earl shouted. "Simply to complete our research," came Doc Blackthorne's voice from a dozen different mouths. "The Whitaker family has always been excellent test subjects. Your grandfather Josiah was particularly helpful during our original studies." That's when old Josiah Whitaker appeared in the crowd, even though he'd been bedridden for months. He was carrying a medical bag and wearing surgical scrubs. "Hello, Earl," Josiah said, but his voice was wrong too. "Time for the family to make their contribution to medical science." Earl raised his shotgun, but I caught his arm. "You can't shoot them," I said. "They're still your neighbors, still people." "Then what do we do?" I looked around the house, thinking fast. All these people had one thing in common. They'd been operated on by Doc Blackthorne, surgically altered. But I was a combat medic. I understood how bodies worked, how they could be broken, and how they could be fixed. "We're going to perform some surgery of our own," I said. I sent Earl to gather everything in the house that could be used as medical supplies: rubbing alcohol, clean towels, his wife's sewing needles. If Doc Blackthorne was using surgery to control these people, maybe surgery could free them too. "What about Dolly and Mary?" Earl asked. I looked at his wife and daughter. Dolly was still cooking, but now she was preparing what looked like surgical instruments instead of food. Mary was sitting in the corner, drawing pictures of human organs with disturbing accuracy. "We'll have to try to save them too," I said. "But first, we deal with the welcoming committee outside." The neighbors had surrounded the house now, maybe 20 people total. They weren't trying to break in, just standing there, waiting. In the moonlight, I could see the surgical scars covering their bodies like road maps. "Ranger Bloodworth," came Doc Blackthorne's voice from all of them at once. "Why don't you join us? I could use someone with your medical training." "Thanks, but I'll pass," I called back. "I wasn't asking." That's when the real horror began. Every person in that crowd started performing surgery on themselves. Right there in the yard, they began cutting into their own bodies with rusty knives and broken glass, talking calmly about procedures while blood poured onto the ground. "Fascinating," said Jenny Hatfield as she opened up her own arm to expose the bone. "The patient shows no signs of distress during the procedure." Earl was being sick in the corner, but I'd seen worse in Vietnam. The thing that got to me wasn't the blood. It was how they kept talking like nothing was happening. "Making minor adjustments to improve functionality," announced Reverend Stone as he began cutting symbols into his own forehead. I realized they were trying to scare us out of the house, and it was working. "Earl, we need to get out of here," I said. "Is there a back way?" He nodded, still pale. "Through the kitchen, there's a door to the root cellar. Comes up about 50 yards from the house." "What about Dolly and Mary?" Earl looked at his wife and daughter, both of them now quietly preparing what looked like surgical supplies. "I don't think they're coming with us willingly." That's when I made the hardest decision of my life. I grabbed the rubbing alcohol and poured it over one of Earl's sewing needles. Then I walked over to Mary. "Honey," I said gently, "I need you to hold still for a minute." She looked up at me with those horrible white eyes. "Are you going to perform a procedure on me, Ranger?" Something like that. I felt along her neck until I found what I was looking for. A small, hard lump under the skin, right at the base of her skull. In Vietnam, we'd seen cases where enemy surgeons implanted control devices in prisoners. if Doc Blackthorn was doing something similar. I made a tiny cut with the needle and squeezed. A small dark object popped out, something that looked like a cross between a beetle and a piece of metal. It hit the floor and immediately started trying to crawl back toward Mary. I stepped on it. Mary blinked and her eyes returned to normal. "Daddy, what's happening? Why does everything hurt?" Earl nearly cried with relief, but I was already moving toward Dolly. The same small lump was there at the base of her neck. When I removed the second device, she collapsed into Earl's arms. "We need to go," I said. "Now." We made it to the root cellar and crawled through the tunnel that led to the woods. Behind us, I could hear Doc Blackthorn's voice getting angry for the first time. "You cannot stop medical progress, Ranger. These people volunteered for the advancement of science." But we were already running through the trees, heading for the old research building. If I was right about what was happening, the only way to stop it was to find the source. The building was blazing with light when we reached it, and I could hear machinery running inside. Lots of it. Through the windows, I saw an impossible sight. Dozens of operating tables, all occupied, with Doc Blackthorn and his dead nurses working on patient after patient. Some of the patients were people I recognized from the area. Others looked like they'd been dead for years, decades even. All of them were awake, watching as their bodies were cut open and rearranged. "My God," Earl whispered. "How many people has he taken?" I was about to answer when I saw the files. Hundreds of manila folders stacked on metal shelves, each one labeled with a name and date. The dates went back to 1943. "He's been doing this for 30 years, I said. Even after he died, he kept working. That's when Doc Blackthorn noticed us at the window. "Ranger," he called out cheerfully. "Perfect timing. I have a table prepared especially for you." The doors to the building burst open, and his surgical staff came pouring out. Not just the nurses, but dozens of patients, all of them carrying medical instruments and wearing hospital gowns soaked with blood. "The Whitaker family has always been cooperative," Doc Blackthorn said, appearing in the doorway. He looked more solid now, more real. "I'm sure you'll be equally helpful." I pulled out my service pistol and fired 6 shots into his chest. The bullets went right through him without slowing him down. "Firearms are not appropriate in a sterile environment," he scolded. "Now, if you'll please lie down on the table." That's when I remembered something from my Army training. In Vietnam, we'd dealt with facilities that had been booby-trapped with white phosphorus. I still had a few grenades in my emergency kit back at the ranger station. "Earl," I said, "can you and your family make it back to town?" "What are you planning?" I looked at the research building, at all those files documenting 30 years of illegal experiments. "I'm going to give Doc Blackthorn a taste of his own medicine." It took me 20 minutes to get back to my ranger station and collect the white phosphorus grenades I'd kept from the war. 20 minutes while Doc Blackthorn's surgical staff spread out through the hills, collecting more patients for his impossible hospital. By the time I returned to Panther Creek, the building was even brighter, and I could hear screaming from inside. Not just pain, but the sound of people being operated on while fully conscious. I didn't have time for a careful plan. I pulled the pins on both grenades and threw them through the windows, then ran like hell. White phosphorus burns at over 5,000 degrees and can't be put out with water. When those grenades went off, they turned that research building into an inferno that could be seen for miles. But here's the thing about supernatural evil. It doesn't die easy. As the building burned, I could hear Doc Blackthorn screaming, not in pain, but in rage. 30 years of research, irreplaceable data. You don't understand what you've done. The fire spread to the surrounding trees, creating a wall full of flame that lit up the entire hollow. And in that light, I saw them, all the people he'd been operating on, stumbling out of the burning building. Some of them were clearly dead, had been for years. They collapsed as soon as the fire reached them, finally at peace. But others, the recent victims, the neighbors, they were alive, free from whatever had been controlling them. Jenny and Mark Hatfield stumbled out, confused and injured, but themselves again. Homer and Bessie McCoy emerged supporting each other, looking around like they'd just woken up from a nightmare. But Doc Blackthorn himself wasn't finished. As the building collapsed, his voice kept echoing from the flames. This is just one facility, Ranger. The research continues in other locations. You cannot stop medical progress. I stayed there all night, watching the fire burn and making sure none of those poor souls needed medical attention. Real medical attention, not the kind Doc Blackthorne had been providing. When the sun came up, all that was left was a pile of ash and melted metal. The surgical instruments, the files, the impossible equipment, all of it gone. But I found something else in the ruins. A metal plate, partially melted, with an official government seal. It was labeled Project Nightingale, Medical Research Division. That's when I understood the real truth. Doc Blackthorne hadn't been working alone back in the 1940s. He'd been part of something bigger, something official. And if his voice from the flames was telling the truth, there were other facilities out there, other doctors continuing the work. The official report blamed the whole incident on chemical contamination from old military storage. The area was quarantined and government agents came in to clean up the scene. They were very thorough, taking soil samples and asking a lot of questions about who had been in the area. They seemed particularly interested in that metal plate I'd found. Earl Whitaker and his family recovered fully, though they never talk about what happened that summer. The other families affect. Ted by Doc Blackthorne's experiments went back to their normal lives, but I noticed they all drive a little faster when they have to pass through Panther Creek after dark. As for me, I stayed on as a ranger, helping people, keeping them safe. That's still what drives me. But I pay attention to the reports that come across my desk now. Stories about impossible diseases showing up in remote areas. Medical equipment running in abandoned buildings. Doctors who died years ago being seen in places they shouldn't be. Last week I got a report from a ranger in West Virginia. Families near an old government research facility were reporting strange illnesses. Children found doctor toys in the woods, equipment running at night in buildings that haven't had power in decades. I'm heading down there tomorrow, because the thing about evil is, it spreads like a disease, and sometimes it takes someone with medical training to cut it out before it can infect anyone else. The night doctors are still out there, still operating, still collecting patients for their impossible procedures. But as long as I'm around, they'll have at least one person who knows how to fight back. After all, I learned a long time ago that sometimes the best medicine is knowing when to burn everything down and start over. My name is Eleanor Songbird, but everyone calls me Ellie. I've been a forest ranger for 9 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything these West Virginia mountains could throw at me. Bears, wild dogs, lost hikers, illegal hunters. Nothing really scared me anymore. That was before I heard the trees singing. It was June of 1963 when everything changed. I was 28 and proud of my work protecting the Monongahela National Forest. My grandmother was Cherokee, and she taught me about plants and trees before she died. She always said trees had spirits, but I never really believed that stuff. I was a scientist, a botanist. I believed in facts you could measure and prove. The call came in on a Tuesday morning. My boss, Chief Ranger Murphy, looked worried when he handed me the file. "We've got a problem at Ravens Hollow," he said. "Timber Industries sent a survey team there 3 days ago. They haven't come back." I knew Ravens Hollow. It was a strange place. A perfect circle of ancient oak trees that had been growing there for over 500 years. The Cherokee considered it sacred ground. The trees grew in a spiral pattern that made no sense to any botanist who studied them. No grass or bushes grew underneath them, just bare earth and thick roots that twisted together like a giant web. "What's the last thing we heard from them?" I asked. Murphy frowned. "Radio contact Sunday night. The team leader, Frank Morrison, said they were having trouble with their equipment. Something about unusual sounds. Then he said..." Murphy looked at his notes. "He said the trees were singing them to sleep." That was the last we heard. I grabbed my gear and headed out. It was a 12-mile hike to Ravens Hollow on an unmarked trail. The logging companies had been trying to cut down those old trees for years, but something always went wrong. Equipment would break down. Workers warranties. would get sick. The Cherokee elders said the spirits protected that place, but I figured it was just coincidence. The hike started normal enough, birds singing, squirrels chattering, the usual forest sounds. But as I got closer to the hollow, things got quiet. Too quiet. By the time I was a mile away, I couldn't hear any animals at all. The air felt thick and heavy, like before a big storm. Then I smelled it. Something sweet and rotten at the same time, like flowers growing on a dead animal. The hollow sat in a natural depression between three hills. Even in the middle of the day, it stayed dark under those massive trees. Their branches were so thick they blocked out most of the sunlight. As I walked down the slope toward the trees, my boots crunched on dead leaves that never seemed to rot away completely. That's when I heard it for the first time. A low humming sound, like someone singing far away. It was beautiful and sad, and it made me feel sleepy. I had to shake my head to stay alert. I found the survey equipment first, 6 sets of tools, measuring devices, and survey stakes arranged in a perfect circle right in the center of the hollow. Everything was clean and organized, like the men had carefully put their things down and walked away. But there was no sign of the men themselves. Then I looked up. Their clothes were hanging from the tree branches about 20 feet off the ground. 6 sets of work clothes, shirts, pants, boots, even underwear, hanging like they'd been carefully placed there. The clothes weren't torn or dirty. They looked like they'd just been taken off and hung up to dry. I called out, but nobody answered. The only sound was that strange humming from the trees. I set up my camp at the edge of the hollow as the sun went down. The humming got louder in the darkness, and I could swear I heard words in it sometimes. Words in a language I didn't recognize, but somehow understood. They seemed to be saying, "Come home. Come rest. Come join us." I tried to radio for backup, but my radio only made static. My flashlight flickered even, though I'd put in fresh batteries that morning. And all night long I felt like something was watching me from those dark trees. I never believed trees could hold memories until that first night in Raven's Hollow. But lying there in my sleeping bag, listening to that impossible song, I started to think my grandmother might have been right about spirits after all. Something was very wrong in these woods, and I was about to find out just how wrong. Morning came gray and cold, even though it was supposed to be summer. The hollow stayed dark under those massive trees, and the temperature never seemed to change. I'd been hot and sweaty on the hike in, but here it felt like autumn all the time. I decided to search the area around the trees more carefully. The 6 missing men had to be somewhere. People don't just disappear, and they definitely don't hang their clothes in trees and walk away naked. The root system under the trees was incredible. Thick roots twisted together above the ground like a wooden maze. Some were as big around as my waist, creating tunnels and caves in the earth. I had to be careful not to trip as I walked around looking for clues. That's when I found the first hole. It was about 10 feet from the biggest oak tree, a shaft going straight down into the earth, perfectly round, like someone had drilled it with a giant machine. I got down on my hands and knees and shined my flashlight into it. The hole was deep, maybe 20 feet, and lined with tree roots that had grown in perfect spirals down the sides. "Hello?" I called down. "Anyone down there?" Something moved at the bottom. I tied my climbing rope to a tree and went down. The walls of the hole were warm, and they seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. The tree roots growing down the sides were fresh and green, not old and brown like they should have been underground. Frank Morrison was at the bottom. He was sitting upright with his back against the wall, naked as the day he was born. His eyes were closed and he looked peaceful, like he was sleeping. But when I touched his shoulder, his skin felt like bark, rough and hard. Tree roots had grown through his body in delicate patterns, in one side and out the other, holding him in place like he was part of the root system. He was dead, but he looked like he'd died happy. I checked for a pulse anyway, but the roots growing through his chest made that pretty pointless. His face was calm, almost smiling. There were no signs of struggle, no wounds, nothing to show how he'd died. It was like he'd just sat down and let the trees grow through him. But here's the really weird part. He looked like he'd been dead for months, all dried out and mummified. But these men had only been missing for 3 days. I climbed back up and radioed for help, but still got nothing but static. My hands were shaking as I marked the location on my map. In 9 years of ranger work, I'd never seen anything like this. I spent the rest of the morning searching for the other 5 men. The hollow wasn't that big, maybe 100 yards across, but it felt huge when you were looking for missing people. Every shadow looked like a body. Every root looked like an arm or leg. I found Tom Bradley around noon. He was still alive. Bradley was pressed up against the trunk of a medium-sized oak tree on the far side of the hollow. At first I thought he was just leaning against it, but when I got closer I saw that the tree bark was growing over his skin. His left arm and shoulder were already covered in rough brown bark, and I could see tiny green buds starting to sprout from his fingers. "Bradley!" I shook his free shoulder. "Tom, can you hear me?" His eyes opened slowly. They were still human, but they had a strange green tint to them. "Ranger. Songbird?" "Hi." His voice sounded far away and dreamy. "You shouldn't have come here. What happened to you? What happened to your team?" He smiled, and when he did, I saw that his teeth were growing tiny. "Roots. We're joining the song, protecting the sacred grove, the trees. They remember everything, the Cherokee, the massacre, all the pain. Tom, I need to get you to a hospital. You're sick." "Not sick." He closed his eyes again. "Home. Finally. Home. Can you hear them singing? They're singing the old songs, the ones from before the soldiers came." The bark was spreading across his chest as I watched. I tried to pull him away from the tree, but the bark had grown around his body like armor. He was stuck fast. "The medicine man, Running Bear. He's protecting us now. We're part of the forest, part of the song. The trees will never let anyone hurt this place again." "Tom, there's no medicine man here. You're hallucinating. You need medical help." But even as I said it, I could hear the humming getting louder. The trees around us seemed to sway without any wind, and I swear I could see faces in the bark. Old faces with sad eyes watching me. "You can join us," Bradley whispered. "The trees want you to stay. They remember your grandmother, remember her songs. You belong here, with us." I backed away from him. The bark had covered his whole torso now, and roots were growing down from his feet into the soil. He was becoming part of the tree, and he seemed happy about it. That's when I heard the scream. It came from deeper in the hollow, where the trees grew thickest. A man's voice, high and terrified, crying for help. I ran toward the sound, crashing through the maze of roots and low branches. I found Mike Santos hanging upside down from a tree branch about 15 feet off the ground. Thick green vines had wrapped around his ankles and were slowly pulling him up higher. He was still alive, still fighting, but the vines were covered in thorns that dug into his skin every time he struggled. "Help me!" he screamed when he saw me. "Cut me down! They're trying to pull me into the tree!" I grabbed my knife and started climbing. The tree bark felt warm under my hands, almost like skin. As I climbed higher, I could hear the humming all around me, coming from the trees themselves. Santos was crying when I reached him. "They got Frank and Tom. The trees ate them. And Bradley. He's turning into one of them." I sawed at the vines holding his ankles. They were tough as rope and bled green sap when I cut them. The tree started shaking like it was trying to throw me off. "What happened?" I asked as I worked. "How did this start?" "We were just doing our job, measuring trees for the logging survey. Then Tom said he heard singing, beautiful singing. We all heard it. It made us so tired. We just wanted to lie down and rest. When we woke up, Frank was gone. Then the trees started hunting us. One of the vines snapped, and Santos dropped a few feet before the others caught him. He screamed as the thorns bit deeper into his legs. "The trees are alive," he gasped. "Really alive. They hate us. They remember when people hurt them before. They're getting revenge." I cut through the last vine and Santos crashed to the ground. He tried to stand, but his legs were torn up bad from the thorns. I helped him up, and we started moving toward the edge of the hollow. That's when the trees really started to move. Getting Mike Santos out of the hollow turned into the longest hour of my life. His legs were so torn up from the thorns that he could barely walk, and every tree we passed seemed to reach for us with their branches. I kept hearing footsteps behind us, but every time I looked back, there was nothing there except shadows that moved wrong. Santos kept mumbling about the singing. "They're calling us back," he said. "The trees want us to come home. They say we belong here now." "Nobody belongs here," I told him. But I wasn't so sure anymore. The humming was getting into my head too, making me feel drowsy and peaceful. It would have been so easy to just sit down and rest. I had to keep shaking my head to stay focused. We made it to my camp at the edge of the hollow just as the sun was going down. I bandaged Santos' legs as best I could and tried the radio again. Still nothing but static, like something was blocking the signal. "We have to get out of here tonight," I told him. "Can you walk 12 miles? Santos looked back at the dark trees. His eyes had that same strange green tint I'd seen in Bradley's. "I don't want to leave," he said quietly. "The song is so beautiful, and they need me. The trees need all of us." "Mike, listen to me. You're not thinking clearly. Something in this place is affecting your mind." But even as I said it, I could feel it too. The hollow felt like home somehow, like I'd been away for a long time and finally come back where I belonged. The rational part of my brain knew this was wrong, but the feeling was so strong. That night, things got much worse. I tied Santos to a tree outside the hollow so he couldn't wander back in while I was sleeping. I felt bad about it, but I'd seen the way he kept looking at those trees like they were calling to him. I woke up around midnight to the sound of someone crying. It was coming from inside the hollow, a man's voice, sobbing and calling for help. Santos was asleep against the tree where I'd tied him, so it wasn't him. I grabbed my flashlight and headed back into the trees. The hollow looked different at night. The humming was louder, and I could see a faint green glow coming from somewhere deep in the grove. The air smelled like flowers and death, and it was so thick I could barely breathe. I found the fourth surveyor, Danny Mullins, about 50 yards in. He was standing in front of the biggest oak tree with his back to me, perfectly still. When I called his name, he didn't turn around. I walked closer and saw why. Tree branches had grown through his body from behind, coming out of his chest and arms like he was being held by a wooden skeleton. The branches were green and alive, with fresh leaves growing from them. Mullins was still breathing, but barely. "Danny?" I touched his shoulder. "Danny, can you hear me?" He turned his head slowly. His face was calm, and his eyes were that same green color. "Ranger Songbird," he said in a voice like wind through leaves. "Running Bear wants to meet you." "Who's Running Bear?" "The medicine man, the one who protects this place. He's been waiting for you to come home." The tree behind Mullins started to change. The bark split open like a door, and an old Cherokee man stepped out. He was tall and thin, with long gray hair and eyes like black water. He wore traditional clothes that seemed to be made of bark and leaves. I knew he couldn't be real, but he looked solid as anything. When he spoke, his voice came from all the trees at once. "Eleanor Songbird," he said, "granddaughter of Mary Crow Feather. You have the old blood. You can hear the songs." I backed away, but my feet felt heavy. The humming from the trees was so loud now it made my bones vibrate. "You're not real," I said. "This is some kind of hallucination." Running Bear smiled sadly. "Your grandmother taught you about the plant spirits. Did you think she was lying?" "My grandmother told stories. This is different. This is the same. The trees remember everything, child. They remember when your people lived here in peace. They remember when the soldiers came with fire and death. They remember the promise I made when I was dying." The air around him shimmered, and suddenly I could see it, not with my eyes, but in my mind. The hollow, as it had been 200 years ago, full of Cherokee families living in harmony with the forest. Then the soldiers coming, the burning, the killing, women and children running between the trees, trying to escape. And an old me, design man, dying from a gunshot wound, pressing his bloody hands against the biggest oak tree and speaking words of power and protection. I bound my spirit to this place, Running Bear said, and the spirits of all who died here. We became one with the trees, so this sacred ground would never be harmed again. That's impossible. Is it? He gestured to Mullins, who was still breathing despite having tree branches growing through his chest. Your people came here to cut down the sacred grove, to turn our ancestors into lumber. We had to stop them. I looked around and realized I could see all 6 of the missing survey team now. They were scattered throughout the hollow, each one merged with a different tree in a different way. Frank Morrison was still down in that hole, but now I could see that the roots growing through him connected to all the other trees. Tom Bradley had become part of his oak tree completely, just a face in the bark now, peaceful and smiling. Mike Santos had somehow gotten loose from where I'd tied him and was walking toward us, his feet growing roots with every step. They were all still alive in a way, but they weren't human anymore. Join us, Running Bear said, and his voice came from the mouths of all 6 men. You have the old blood. You belong here. Help us protect the sacred grove. I wanted to. The feeling was so strong it hurt to resist. The trees were singing louder now, and I could understand all the words. They were singing about home, about belonging, about eternal peace in the forest. But somewhere in my mind I remembered my training. I was a forest ranger. My job was to protect the forest, not become part of it. There has to be another way, I said. Running Bear's eyes flashed with anger, and all the trees around us started to move. The trees came alive all at once. Branches swept down at me like giant arms. Roots burst out of the ground and tried to wrap around my legs. The 6 survey team members started walking toward me from all directions, their eyes glowing green in the darkness. I ran. Behind me, I could hear Running Bear's voice booming from every tree. You cannot leave. This is your home now. Join your brothers. The hollow had turned into a maze. Trees that had been in one place were now in another. Paths that led out now led deeper in. Every direction I ran just took me further into the grove. I could hear equipment starting up somewhere in the woods, chainsaws and bulldozers. The logging company had sent reinforcements. No! Running Bear's voice was full of rage now. No machines, no cutting. The trees went crazy. I saw a huge oak uproot itself and go crashing toward the sound of the machinery. Other trees started swaying and reaching, their branches whipping through the air like they were fighting an invisible enemy. I used the distraction to keep running, but I was getting lost. The hollow was changing around me, growing bigger, and I couldn't find the way out. Then I heard the screaming. The logging crew, maybe 8 or 10 men with heavy equipment, had made it into the grove. But the trees were ready for them. I saw a bulldozer get picked up by massive roots and thrown into the air like a toy. Chainsaws sparked and died as the trees they were cutting grew back faster than they could be cut. One by one, the loggers were dragged down into holes that opened up under their feet, or wrapped in vines that appeared out of nowhere. Their screams echoed through the hollow for a few minutes, then went quiet. The trees had won again. I was hiding behind a fallen log when Running Bear found me. He materialized out of the darkness like smoke, and his face was furious. More death, he said. More blood on the sacred ground. When will your people learn? They didn't know, I said. They were just doing their jobs. Their job was to destroy, to cut down the ancestors, to turn sacred trees into lumber and money. He was right, but that didn't make it easy, sire, to hear those men die. There has to be a better way, I told him. All this killing, it's not protecting the forest. It's just making more anger, more hate. What would you have me do? Let them cut down the grove? Let them destroy what took 500 years to grow? I stood up slowly, my hands shaking. An idea was forming in my mind. A crazy idea, but maybe the only chance I had. My grandmother taught me about the plant spirits, I said. She taught me the old songs, too. The ones for talking to trees. Running Bear's eyes narrowed. You would bargain with us? I would make you a promise. I started singing, using the Cherokee words my grandmother had taught me when I was little. Words for asking permission to enter the forest, for promising to do no harm, for offering protection in return for friendship. The trees grew quiet. The humming stopped. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. What do you promise? Running Bear asked. I promise to spend my life protecting this grove and others like it, not as a tree spirit, but as a living person who can work in the human world. I can make sure no logging companies ever get permits for this area. I can get the hollow declared a protected site. I can do more good alive than dead. And if you fail? If you break your promise? I looked around at the 6 survey team members, still standing like wooden statues throughout the grove. They were watching me with their green eyes, waiting to see what I would choose. If I fail, I said, then I'll come back here and join them willingly. Running Bear studied me for a long moment. Then he reached out and touched my forehead with one finger. It felt like lightning running through my brain, and suddenly I could hear every tree in the forest. I could feel their roots talking to each other underground, sharing water and nutrients and information. I could sense their growth, their health, their fears. You are bound to us now, he said. You will feel when the forest is threatened. You will know when the sacred places are in danger. And you will remember what happens to those who break their promises to the spirits. The connection was overwhelming. I could feel hundreds of trees, thousands of them, all connected in a vast network that stretched across the mountains. They were all singing now, a song of acceptance and warning and hope. Go, Running Bear said. Do what you have promised. But remember, we are watching. He faded back into the trees, and the grove grew quiet. The 6 survey team members stayed where they were, part of the forest now forever. I could still hear them sometimes, humming along with the wind. I found my way out of the hollow as the sun was coming up. My radio started working again as soon as I got clear of the trees. I called for backup and rescue teams, even though I knew it was too late to save anyone. The official report blamed the deaths on an underground methane explosion. Dangerous gases had built up in natural caves under Raven's Hollow, causing hallucinations and eventually suffocation. The area was declared geologically unstable and off-limits to all commercial development. I wrote the report myself. Nobody questioned it. Nobody wanted to dig deeper into what had really happened. The logging company collected their insurance money and moved on to other forests. The families of the dead men got their compensation and tried to forget. But I couldn't forget. Every night I could feel the connection Running Bear had given me. I could sense the health of every tree for miles around. When someone dumped chemicals in a stream, I felt the trees along the banks getting sick. When developers tried to clear land for new houses, I felt the forest crying out in pain. And I kept my promise. I became the most effective environmental activist in West Virginia. I testified at hearings, organized protests, filed lawsuits. I used my scientific background and my ranger credentials to fight every development project that threatened old-growth forests. People started calling me the tree whisperer because I always seemed to know where the most important habitats were. They had no idea how right they were. Over the years, I saved thousands of acres. I got Raven's Hollow and dozens of other sacred sites declared as protected wilderness areas. I made sure the Cherokee burial grounds stayed safe from development. And every time I succeeded, I could feel the approval of the forest spirits. But sometimes I failed. 3 years after Raven's Hollow, a mining company got permits to strip mine a mountain that held a grove of 300-year-old hemlocks. I fought them in court for 2 years, but they had better lawyers and more money. They cut down every tree on that mountain and scraped away the topsoil to get at the coal underneath. That night, I felt every one of those ancient trees die. Their death songs echoed in my mind for weeks, and I knew I had let them down. I drove back to Raven's Hollow for the first time in 3 years. The grove looked exactly the same. The massive oaks still grew in their spiral pattern, still hummed their ancient songs. The survey equipment was still there, rusted now and covered with moss. And the 6 survey team members were still there too. More tree than human, but still aware, still watching. Running Bear was waiting for me by the biggest oak tree. "You have done well," he said, "but not well enough. I tried to save the hemlocks. I did everything I could. We know. But it was not enough. The sacred places are still dying. Your people's hunger for wood and coal and land grows stronger every year." I knelt down and pressed my hands against the roots of the ancient oak. "What do you want me to do? I'm just one person." "You are more than that now. You carry the voice of the forest. Others will listen to you, follow you. Build an army of protectors. Teach them the old ways. Show them that the trees are not just resources to be harvested." He was right. Over the next 20 years, I recruited hundreds of young people to the environment. TAL movement. I taught them about forest ecology, about the connections between all living things, about the sacred relationship between humans and trees. Some of them went on to become rangers themselves. Others became lawyers, scientists, politicians. All of them learned to hear the voice of the forest. We saved a lot of trees together. But Raven's Hollow remained the heart of it all. Every few months, I would hike back to check on the grove. The 6 survey team members were still there, gradually becoming more and more tree-like as the years passed. Frank Morrison had disappeared completely into the root system. Tom Bradley was just a face in the bark now, dreaming tree dreams. The others were following the same path, slowly and peacefully becoming part of the forest, forever. Sometimes I wondered if I should join them. The connection Running Bear had given me grew stronger every year. I could feel every chainsaw blade, every bulldozer track, every chemical spill. The pain of the dying forests was becoming harder to bear. But I kept my promise. I stayed human. I stayed in the fight. Now I'm 62 years old, and I've spent my whole adult life protecting trees. I've saved more forests than I can count. I've trained a new generation of environmental activists. I've made sure that places like Raven's Hollow will be protected long after I'm gone. But sometimes, on quiet nights, I still hear the trees singing. They're calling me home, telling me I've done enough, that I've earned my rest. The song is beautiful and peaceful, and it promises an end to all the worry and struggle and pain. Someday soon, I might listen. But not today. Today, there are still forests to save, still young people to teach, still promises to keep. The trees have waited 500 years. They can wait a little longer. After all, I'm not the only guardian of the grove anymore. The forest has nigh voices now, many protectors, and every one of them learned to hear the ancient songs. The trees remember everything. And now, so do we. My name is Robert Huntersville, but everyone calls me Bob. I've been a ranger in George Washington National Forest for 17 years now. Before that, I spent my younger days hunting big game across 3 states. But something changed in me after I shot my last trophy buck. Looking into those dying eyes, I realized I'd rather protect these animals than kill them. I thought I knew every dangerous creature in these Virginia mountains. Bears, sure. The occasional mountain lion. Wild boar that could tear a man open. But nothing prepared me for what I found in Hunger Hollow that September of 1981. The call came in on a Tuesday morning. 4 hunters from Richmond, experienced guys who'd been coming up here for 15 years, were 6 days overdue. Their families were getting worried. The hunting party included Jim Morrison, Mike Santos, Dave Kim, and Bobby Park. All of them knew these woods better than most locals. Last we heard from them was Thursday. Sheriff Williams told me over the radio. Jim called in around noon, said they'd found something real interesting, some kind of feeding ground, he said. Then nothing. I loaded up my truck with camping gear and headed for Hunger Hollow. The name always made me uncomfortable. Local Cherokee avoided that valley for generations, called it the place where things eat things. I'd always figured it was just old superstition. Maybe the soil was bad for crops, or there were too many predators. Every forest has places like that. But as I drove the winding dirt road toward the valley, something felt wrong. The forest was too quiet. No bird songs, no rustling in the underbrush. Even the insects seemed muted. In 17 years of ranging, I'd never heard the woods this silent. The landslide from last month's heavy rains had blocked the main trail into Hunger Hollow. I had to park at the bottom and climb in on foot, carrying my paws, up the steep, rocky path. It took me 3 hours to reach the hunter's camp, and what I found there made my blood run cold. The camp looked like a tornado had hit it. The heavy canvas tents were shredded to ribbons. A solid oak picnic table had been snapped in half like a toothpick. Their rifles were scattered around the clearing, barrels twisted and bent. One gun was actually tied in a knot around a tree branch. But the worst part was the smell. Sweet, rotten meat mixed with something wild and musky, like a slaughterhouse mixed with a zoo. I've tracked wounded bears before. I know what blood smells like when it's been sitting in the sun. This was different, older, hungrier. I found their radio smashed against a tree, along with most of their supplies. Canned food was scattered everywhere, some cans punctured by what looked like massive claws. But here's the strange part. None of the food was eaten. Whatever destroyed their camp wasn't interested in beans and peaches. The tracks around the camp were impossible. At first I thought they were bear prints, but they were huge, bigger than any black bear I'd ever seen. The front paws measured 14 inches long and nearly 10 inches wide. The back paws were even larger, but the spacing between the tracks suggested something that walked upright at least part of the time. Bears can rear up and walk on 2 legs for short distances, but these tracks showed a creature that had spent considerable time walking like a man. I followed the tracks toward the tree line where I found something that made me stop dead in my tracks. Claw marks scored deep into the bark of an old pine tree, 12 feet off the ground. The marks were fresh, still weeping sap. Whatever made them had claws like railroad spikes and the reach of a giant. That's when I noticed the silence wasn't complete. From somewhere deeper in the valley came a sound I'd never heard before. A wet, rhythmic crunching, like someone stepping on dry leaves mixed with the sound of a dog chewing a bone. The sound echoed off the valley walls, making it impossible to tell where it was coming from. I'd come prepared to find 4 lost hunters. Instead, I'd stumbled into something that turned my understanding of these mountains upside down. Whatever lived in Hunger Hollow was bigger and more dangerous than anything that should exist in Virginia. And somewhere out there, it might still have those 4 men. As the sun started to set behind the valley walls, painting everything in blood-red shadows, I made camp in what was left of the hunter's clearing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the darkness between the trees. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of movement, something large, shifting through the shadows, always just at the edge of my vision. I'd tracked dangerous animals before, but this was the first time I felt like I was the one being hunted. I woke up at dawn to find massive tracks circling my tent. The creature had come within 10 feet of where I slept, close enough that I should have heard it approaching. But whatever made those tracks moved in complete silence despite its enormous size. The morning air still carried that sickly sweet smell of rotting meat. I packed up quickly and began following the tracks deeper into the valley. The trail led toward a series of limestone caves that honeycombed the far end of Hunger Hollow. As I got closer to the caves, the smell grew stronger, and that wet crunching sound returned. The tracks led to a narrow cave entrance partially hidden by fallen rocks. I had to squeeze through sideways, my flashlight beam dancing across walls marked by deep claw gouges. The cave opened into a larger chamber, and that's where I found Jim Morrison. He was 30 feet up in the air. Jim's body hung from a rocky shelf near the cave ceiling, somehow wedged into a crack barely wide enough for a man. But there was no way he could have climbed up there. The cave, walls were smooth limestone, impossible to scale without ropes and equipment. And Jim was afraid of heights. His hunting buddies always teased him about it. I managed to get his body down using my climbing gear. Jim had been dead for days, but his body showed something I'd never seen before. 2 massive puncture wounds on either side of his neck, like he'd been bitten by something with fangs the size of my thumb. But here's the strange part. There was almost no blood around the wounds. It was like something had drained him completely dry. The bite marks were wrong for any animal I knew. Too wide apart for a bear, too deep for a mountain lion. The spacing suggested jaws nearly 2 feet across. I've seen what an angry bear can do to a man, and this wasn't it. I was photographing Jim's body when I heard voices echoing from deeper in the cave system, faint but definitely human. Someone calling for help. The cave tunnels twisted and branched like a maze. I followed the voices for nearly an hour, my flashlight beam the only thing keeping me from complete darkness. The smell got worse the deeper I went. Finally, the tunnel opened into another chamber, larger than the first. Mike Santos was still alive. I found him in a small alcove, conscious but barely able to speak. Mike had always been the strongest of the hunting group, a construction worker who could lift twice his own weight. Now he looked like a skeleton wrapped in loose skin. His eyes were sunken deep in his head, and when he tried to talk, his voice was just a whisper. "Bob?" he croaked. "That you?" "Mike! Jesus, what happened? Where are Dave and Bobby?" He tried to sit up but couldn't manage it. "Things been feeding on me. Keeps me alive. Meat stays fresh that way." The words sent ice through my veins. "What thing, Mike? What are you talking about?" "Vampire bear," he whispered. "Big as a truck. Comes every night. Bites me. Drinks." His eyes rolled back and he started shaking. I got him some water and tried to keep him talking. Mike told me the creature had found their camp on the second night. Described something that walked on 2 legs like a man but had the head and claws of a massive bear. It had killed Jim immediately but kept the other 3 alive for feeding. "Takes a little each night," Mike said. "Just enough to keep us weak but breathing. Dave's been here longer. Thing took him yesterday. He was empty, like a deflated balloon. Mike died while I was trying to get him ready for transport. Just stopped breathing like his body finally gave up. But before he died, he grabbed my arm with surprising strength. 'It knows you're here,' he whispered. 'Been watching you since yesterday. It's coming tonight.' I got out of those caves as fast as I could, Mike's body over my shoulder. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me through the tunnels. My flashlight kept catching movement in the darkness behind me. Something large keeping pace but staying just out of sight. When I finally emerged from the cave system, the sun was setting. I made camp in the open, figuring whatever lived in Hunger Hollow preferred the dark spaces underground. I was wrong. Around midnight, I heard something moving through the forest. Branches snapping under enormous weight, the sound of claws scraping against tree bark. And underneath it all, a low rumbling noise like a diesel engine idling. I kept my fire burning bright and my rifle across my lap. Every now and then, my firelight would catch 2 red eyes reflecting from the tree line. They were 8 feet off the ground and spaced too far apart to belong to any normal animal. The eyes would appear for a moment, then vanish, only to show up somewhere else entirely. Whatever was out there was playing with me, testing my reactions, learning. When dawn finally came, I found massive tracks all around my camp. The creature had circled me for hours, coming within arm's reach of my sleeping bag. But it never attacked. Maybe the fire kept it away, or maybe it was just studying me like I'd been studying it. I now knew 3 things for certain. Something unnatural lived in Hunger Hollow. It was smart enough to play games with its prey, and it was saving me for last. I should have left Hunger Hollow right then. Should have called in the state police and the National Guard and anyone else with bigger guns than mine. But I couldn't get Mike's words out of my head. Bobby Park was still out there somewhere, and Dave Kim's body needed to be found. As a ranger, I had a responsibility to these mountains and the people who got lost in them. I spent the next day searching for more caves and following tracks that seemed to appear and disappear at random. The creature was definitely watching me. I'd catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, and twice I found trees that had been freshly marked with those massive claw gouges, like it was leaving me messages. That afternoon, I found Dave Kim's body near a stream about half a mile from the main cave system. Mike had been right about him looking empty. Dave's body was completely drained of all fluids, blood, saliva, even the moisture in his eyes. His skin felt like old leather, and when I tried to move him, he was light as a scarecrow. Whatever had fed on him had taken everything. But the strangest part was his face. Dave died with his eyes wide open, staring up at the sky, and his mouth was frozen in what almost looked like a smile. Not the grimace of pain or fear you'd expect, but an expression of peace. Like whatever happened to him hadn't been entirely unpleasant. I was taking photographs of Dave's body when I heard shouting from deeper in the forest. A man's voice, weak, but definitely alive. Bobby Park. The voice led me to another cave system, this one larger and deeper than where I'd found the others. The main entrance was big enough to drive a truck through, and the smell that poured out of it was overwhelming. Not just rotting meat now, but something older and more complex, like a tomb that had been sealed for centuries. I found Bobby in a natural chamber deep underground, maybe 200 feet from the surface. He was alive but barely conscious, propped against the cave wall like a rag doll. Like Mike, he looked like he was wasting away from some terrible disease. But Bobby was alert enough to warn me. "Get out of here, Bob," he whispered when he saw my flashlight. "Things coming back soon. Always comes back when the sun goes down." The cave chamber was decorated like some kind of twisted museum. Bones covered the floor, not just from recent victims, but old bones that had been there for years, decades maybe. Human skulls were arranged along the walls, and I could see the same puncture marks in the neck bones that I'd found on Jim Morrison. In the center of the chamber was what looked like a feeding area, a depression in the rock floor, stained dark with old blood and surrounded by more bones than I could count. Some of the bones looked very old, maybe even centuries old. This thing had been feeding in Hunger Hollow for a very long time. "How long has it kept you here?" I asked Bobby. "Since Thursday night," he said. "Comes every evening just after dark. Feeds slow, takes just enough to keep me alive. Says it likes the fear. Makes the blood taste better." "It talks?" Bobby nodded weakly. "Not words. Pictures in your head. Shows you things. Things it's done to others. Promises it will be quick if you stop fighting." He grabbed my arm. "Don't listen to it, Bob. Once it gets in your head, you start wanting it to feed. Start looking forward to it." I was trying to help Bobby to his feet when I heard it, that diesel engine rumbling echoing through the cave tunnels. But closer now, much closer. "It's coming," Bobby whispered. "Leave me. Run." But I couldn't leave him there. I got Bobby's arm over my shoulder and started toward the cave entrance as fast as I could manage. Behind us, that rumbling sound grew louder, and I could hear something massive moving through the tunnels, claws scraping stone, the sound of breathing that came from lungs the size of oil drums. We almost made it to the entrance when my flashlight beam caught something that stopped me cold. Blocking the cave mouth was the largest creature I'd ever seen. It stood 12 feet tall on its hind legs, covered in dark fur that seemed to absorb light. The body was bear-like, but wrong in every proportion. Too tall, too lean, with arms that hung almost to the ground. The head was definitely ursine, but the skull was elongated and the jaws were filled with teeth that no bear ever possessed. Fangs like railroad spikes, designed for piercing rather than tearing. But the eyes were the worst part. They glowed with an intelligence that was almost human. This wasn't just a large predator acting on instinct. This thing was smart. It studied us like a scientist examining specimens, tilting its massive head from side to side. Bobby whispered, "Don't look directly at it. That's how it gets in your head." But it was too late. The moment I met those glowing red eyes, images flooded my mind. I saw the creature's feeding ritual from its perspective, the careful selection of prey, the slow, methodical draining of life force, the pleasure it took in fear and desperation. And I saw its plans for me. The creature took a step forward, and I noticed it didn't make any sound despite its enormous size. It moved with the fluid grace of something that had perfected the art of hunting. When it opened its jaws, I could see rows of teeth that seemed designed specifically for the kind of puncture wounds I'd found on the victims. I raised my rifle and fired 3 shots center mass. All 3 bullets hit their target, and I heard the creature grunt in pain. But instead of dropping, it looted, kept down at the wounds with what almost seemed like amusement. The bullet holes were already closing, the dark fur growing back over pink scars that faded even as I watched. That's when I realized we weren't dealing with just an unusual predator. This thing was supernatural, and it was just getting started with us. The creature let out a sound that was part roar, part laugh, and started moving toward us with deliberate, measured steps. Behind me, Bobby Park was whimpering something about how it was going to keep us alive for weeks, feeding a little at a time. I had 2 bullets left in my rifle and no idea if they would do any good at all. I grabbed Bobby and dragged him deeper into the cave, away from the creature. My mind was racing, trying to remember everything I knew about these limestone caves. There had to be another way out. Most cave systems in this area connected to underground streams that eventually led to surface exits. Behind us, the creature followed at a leisurely pace. It knew we were trapped, and it seemed to enjoy watching us run. Every few seconds, it would let out that rumbling laugh, echoing off the cave walls like thunder. We stumbled through narrow passages for what felt like hours. My flashlight was getting dim, and Bobby was getting weaker. Several times I had to stop and let him rest, all while listening to the steady sound of claws scraping stone somewhere behind us. "Bob," Bobby gasped during one of our rest stops. "Thing told me something about why it chose us." "What do you mean?" "We hunt for sport, kill for trophies. It says we're hypocrites, pretend to respect nature while we destroy it." Bobby coughed up something dark. "Says it's teaching us what it feels like to be prey." The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent my younger years as exactly the kind of trophy hunter this creature seemed to despise. Maybe that's why it was saving me for last. It wanted me to understand what all those animals had felt in their final moments. We finally reached a chamber with the sound of running water. An underground stream flowed through one wall and disappeared through a crack on the opposite side. If we could follow the water, it might lead to an exit, but the creature had anticipated our plan. As we entered the water chamber, it was already waiting for us, having somehow circled around through passages we didn't know existed. Up close in the confined space, it was even more terrifying. The smell of decay and ancient death was overwhelming. This time, when it looked at me, the mental images were different. I saw the creature's origin, not born, but awakened. Sometime in the distant past, when the Cherokee still controlled these mountains, something had disturbed a place that should have been left alone. The creature was old, far older than any natural animal, and it had been feeding in Hunger Hollow for generations. I also saw what it planned for Bobby and me. We would be kept alive for weeks, maybe months, fed on gradually while the creature savored our life force. Our terror and desperation would season the feeding, making it more satisfying. But I saw something else in those images, a weakness. The creature was powerful, but not invincible. It could be hurt, possibly even killed, but not with conventional weapons. The Cherokee had known how to fight it. There were rituals, specific weapons, sacred items that could wound something supernatural. Unfortunately, I was a forest ranger, not a medicine man. All I had was a nearly empty rifle and a dying flashlight. The creature started toward us, moving through the shallow water without making a ripple. Its claws extended from massive paws, each one the size of a hunting knife. When it opened its jaws, I could see that its fangs were hollow, like a snake's, designed to drain rather than tear. I fired my last 2 bullets at point-blank range, aiming for its head. Both shots hit, and this time the creature actually stumbled backward. Dark blood flowed. From the wounds. But again, they began healing almost immediately. But the bullets had bought us seconds. I pushed Bobby toward the crack where the stream disappeared and started squeezing through myself. The opening was barely wide enough for a man, too small for something the creature's size. We popped out of the crack into another cave system, this one smaller, but with the blessed sound of wind moving through it. Fresh air meant an exit somewhere. I got Bobby over my shoulder and started following the air current, praying we'd find daylight before the creature found another way around. Behind us, I could hear it clawing at the rock, trying to widen the opening. Stone chips scattered into the water as it worked to follow us. The tunnel sloped upward, and soon I could see gray light filtering from above. We emerged from a small cave opening on the side of a cliff, maybe 50 feet above the valley floor. It was dawn, and the sight of real sunlight felt like salvation. But our relief was short-lived. Below us, at the base of the cliff, the creature was already waiting. It must have run through the forest while we were crawling through caves. Now it stood in the morning light, no longer bothering to hide in shadows. In daylight, I could see details I'd missed in the caves. Old scars covered its body, bullet wounds, knife cuts, even what looked like burn marks. Other people had tried to fight this thing over the years. None had succeeded. Bobby died while we stood on that cliff ledge, just stopped breathing and slumped against the rock wall. The creature had been feeding on him for too long, and his body finally gave up. But before he died, he pressed something into my hand, a small piece of carved bone, maybe Cherokee, that he'd apparently been carrying as a lucky charm. The bone felt warm in my palm, and when I looked at it closely, I could see it had been carved with symbols I didn't recognize. But somehow, looking at those symbols, I knew what I had to do. The creature started climbing the cliff face, moving up the sheer rock like gravity didn't excite. Then its claws found purchase in cracks too small to see. I had maybe 2 minutes before it reached our ledge. I took the bone charm and used my pocket knife to cut my palm, letting blood flow over the carved symbols. The bone grew warmer, and the symbols seemed to glow with faint light. I don't know why I did it. Some instinct or memory from the creature's mental images told me blood and sacred objects were connected to whatever ritual the Cherokee had used. When the creature reached our ledge, something had changed. Instead of looking at me with predatory amusement, its red eyes showed something I hadn't seen before. Uncertainty. It could smell the blood on the sacred bone, and some ancient memory made it hesitate. I held up the charm and spoke the only Cherokee words I knew, a blessing an old-timer had taught me years ago for asking the forest permission to hunt. I have no idea if I pronounced it correctly, but the creature recoiled like I'd struck it with a whip. That's when I realized the truth. The creature wasn't just supernatural. It was cursed. Something bound to this place by old magic, and that same magic could potentially be used against it. The Cherokee charm in my blood had created some kind of protection, at least temporarily. But temporary wasn't going to be enough. The creature was already recovering from its initial shock, and I could see anger replacing uncertainty in those red eyes. In seconds, it would attack regardless of whatever protection the charm provided. That's when I heard the helicopters. The rescue helicopters found me on that cliff ledge 3 hours later. By then, the creature was gone, vanished back into whatever hole it had crawled out of. The official report stated that 4 hunters had been killed by a rogue black bear, and I was treated for exhaustion and exposure. They never found the creature's body, of course, when the search team scoured Hunger Hollow over the following weeks. They found the caves and the bone chambers. They found evidence of the feeding sites and the old remains, but the thing responsible had simply disappeared. The area was closed to hunting and camping, officially due to dangerous wildlife activity. A few months later, development plans for the valley were quietly canceled. The Cherokee Nation requested that Hunger Hollow be declared a sacred site, and the federal government agreed without much argument. Sometimes bureaucracy works in mysterious ways. I retired from the Forest Service 6 months later. Officially, I took early retirement due to stress and health issues. Unofficially, I couldn't stand being in the woods anymore. Every shadow looked like a threat. Every strange sound made me reach for weapons I no longer carried. But retirement didn't mean I stopped paying attention. Over the years, I've kept in touch with other rangers, park services, and wildlife officials across several states. I created an informal network of people who understand that not everything in our forests has a Latin name and a place in field guides. The reports started coming in about 2 years after Hunger Hollow. Livestock found drained of blood in remote areas of West Virginia. Massive tracks that didn't match any known animal, found near isolated farms in Kentucky. Hunting parties that went missing for days. found alive but suffering from severe anemia and reporting dreams about vampire bears. The creature had offspring, or maybe there had been more than one all along. The supernatural predators were spreading through the Appalachian Mountains, staying hidden but continuing to feed. My network tracks these incidents now. We've learned to recognize the signs: animals fleeing an area for no apparent reason, missing persons with no logical explanation, livestock deaths with those characteristic puncture wounds. When we find evidence of supernatural predator activity, we make sure the areas get closed to public access. Sometimes we claim there's been a toxic spill or a military training exercise. People accept official explanations more readily than supernatural ones. 3 weeks ago, I got a call from a park ranger in Tennessee. Hikers had found a destroyed campsite near the Great Smoky Mountains. Tents shredded, equipment twisted and bent. 4 college students missing for 6 days past their scheduled return. The ranger described bite marks on trees 12 feet high and tracks that measured 15 inches long. He mentioned the smell of rotting meat and musk and the unnatural silence that had settled over the area. I'm driving down to Tennessee tomorrow. At 73, I'm too old for this kind of work, but I'm the only one who's seen these things and lived to tell about it. The Cherokee charm Bobby gave me still hangs around my neck, and I've learned to carve similar protection symbols from blessed bone. They don't kill the creatures, but they provide some defense. I know I won't be able to do this forever. My hands shake now, and my eyes aren't what they used to be. But until someone else takes over this watch, I'll keep tracking the spread of whatever ancient curse was awakened in Hunger Hollow. Because somewhere in the mountains tonight, something is hunting that thinks of human beings as food. Something that feeds on terror and life force, that keeps its prey alive for days while it slowly drains them dry. The Cherokee were right to avoid Hunger Hollow. They knew there are places in this world where things eat things, where the natural order gets turned upside down and prey becomes predator. I learned that lesson the hard way, and I'll carry the knowledge until the day I die. Hopefully in a bed somewhere, of old age and natural causes, but given what I've seen, I wouldn't bet on it. My name is Robert Huntersville, and I've spent the last 25 years hunting monsters that aren't supposed to exist. If you ever find yourself in the deep woods and everything goes silent, if you smell rotting meat and musk where there shouldn't be any, if you see red eyes watching from the darkness, 8. My name is Catherine Gravedigger, though most folks just call me Kate. I know what you're thinking about the last name. Trust me, I've heard all the jokes. Been a park ranger here in Jefferson National Forest for 8 years now, and before that, well, let's just say I took a different path to get here. I used to be in the seminary, wanted to be a chaplain, help people find God and all that. Even made it overseas to Vietnam for a spell, ministering to soldiers who were dying too young and too far from home. But after what I saw there, boys calling out for their mothers while their life bled into the mud, I figured maybe God had better things to do than listen to my prayers. So I came home to Virginia, traded my collar for a ranger's badge, and found myself assigned to the loneliest stretch of mountains you ever did see. Crying Woman Mountain got its name from an old Cherokee story about a mother who lost her children to winter. Local folks say if you listen real close on cold nights, you can still hear her weeping. I always figured that was just the wind through the pines, but then again, I used to think a lot of things that turned out to be wrong. It was March of 1969 when everything started. Late snow was melting off the peaks, and the ground was doing that spring thing where it gets soft and starts shifting around. That's when hikers began reporting strange sounds coming from up near the old Thornfield Trail. Church bells ringing underground and singing that seemed to rise right up from the earth itself. The first call came in on a Tuesday morning. Bob Jenkins from Staunton said he and his wife had been camping up near Crying Woman's north face when they heard what sounded like a whole congregation singing hymns at 3 a.m. Said it was coming from about 20 feet below their tent. Probably just some kids with a radio, I told him. But Bob insisted. Ted, it was real singing. Human voices in harmony, old-fashioned church music. His wife was so spooked they packed up and left in the dark. That might have been the end of it, except 2 days later, a group of college students from Virginia Tech went missing in the same area. 7 of them, all part of some religious studies program, had gotten permits to hike up and do research on folk religious practices in Appalachian communities. Their professor, Dr. Helen Stone, was supposed to check in every day by radio. When she missed 2 check-ins, the university called us. I hiked up there Friday morning following the trail markers they'd left. The weather was turning nasty, clouds hanging low and heavy, making everything look gray and dead. About 5 miles up Thornfield Trail, I found their base camp. Tents still standing, gear scattered around like they'd left in a hurry. But what made my skin crawl was the smell hanging in the air. Old flowers and incense, like you'd find in a church that hadn't been aired out in years. That's when I heard it. Faint at first, but definitely there. The sound of an organ playing somewhere underground. Deep, mournful notes that seemed to vibrate up through the soles of my boots. And underneath that, voices. Lots of voices, singing something that might have been Amazing Grace, but wrong somehow. Too slow, too sad, like a funeral dirge. I followed the sound to a clearing about 100 yards from the students' camp. The ground there looked disturbed, not fresh dug exactly, but like something had pushed up from below. And right in the middle of it all, sticking up through the dirt like a finger pointing at God, was the top of a church steeple. I radioed for backup, but it would be hours before anyone could reach me. The smart thing would have been to wait, mark the area, and come back with a proper team. But those kids were missing, and that steeple wasn't something you see every day. Someone had been digging around it. Professional excavation work with proper tools and grid markers. Fresh soil was piled in neat rows, and I could see where they'd uncovered part of the roof. The singing got louder as I got closer. Real voices, definitely human, but there was something off about the harmony. It was too perfect, like they'd been practicing the same songs for a very long time. I called out, thinking maybe the students were trapped in some kind of underground cave-in, but my voice just seemed to get swallowed up. That's when I found David Faithful. He was lying in what looked like a freshly dug grave about 30 feet from the steeple, hands folded across his chest like he was laid out for viewing at a funeral home. David was the graduate student leading the research project. I'd met him when they picked up their permits. Young kid from Richmond studying mountain religious practices for his thesis. But David wasn't sleeping. His skin was gray-white, and when I checked for a pulse, he was cold as winter ground. No wounds, no signs of struggle, nothing to show how he died. But here's the thing that made my hands shake. Somebody had prepared him for burial. His hair was combed neat, his clothes were clean and pressed, and there was a smell around him like embalming fluid mixed with old roses. I was still trying to make sense of it when I heard a voice call my name. "Ranger Gravedigger, is that you?" I spun around and saw Mary Righteous, another of the students, sitting on what looked like a wooden pew that was somehow sticking up through the ground. She was dressed in her hiking clothes, but they looked different somehow, older, like something from a history book. "Mary, thank God. Are you hurt? Where are the others?" She smiled at me, but it wasn't her smile. Mary had been a bright, eager kid when I'd met her before. This smile was peaceful in a way that made my blood run cold. "We're in service," she said in a voice that didn't quite sound like hers. The words came out formal, like as she was reciting something. "The Reverend is preaching such a beautiful sermon. Won't you join us? Mary, we need to get you out of here. David has joined the congregation," she said, still smiling that wrong smile. "He's resting until the resurrection. We're all waiting for the resurrection." That's when I noticed her eyes. They were looking at me, but also through me, like she was seeing something I couldn't. And when she breathed, I couldn't see any mist in the cold air. I grabbed her arm, trying to pull her up from that impossible pew, but her skin felt like ice. She didn't resist, didn't fight me, but she wouldn't budge either. It was like she was rooted to the spot. "The service isn't over," she said. "It's never over. Reverend Tombstone says we must worship until the end of days, until we're worthy." The organ music swelled up from underground, joined by a choir that sounded like it had 100 voices. And underneath all that singing, I heard something that made every nerve in my body scream. The voice of a preacher delivering a sermon, his words echoing up from 20 feet below the ground. "Come, children," the voice called, deep and hollow, like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "Come and join our everlasting service. Come and be saved." I ran. I'm not proud of it, but I ran back through those woods like the devil himself was chasing me, stumbled over roots, tore my uniform on branches, and didn't stop until I reached my truck. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely work the radio. When backup finally arrived, 2 other rangers and a sheriff's deputy, we found the camp exactly as I'd left it. But David's body was gone, and so was Mary. The excavation site looked different too, like the earth had settled back into place. The only sign anything had happened was that church steeple still pointing up at the gray sky. And from somewhere deep underground, if you listened real close, you could still hear them singing. By Saturday morning, we had a full search and rescue operation going. State police, volunteer fire, departments, even brought in some dogs from Charlottesville. But every team we sent up that mountain came back with the same story. They'd hear singing coming from underground, find evidence of recent digging, but no trace of the missing students. Dr. Stone, the professor leading the expedition, had left detailed notes in her tent. Turns out they weren't just studying mountain religion. They were specifically looking for the ruins of Thornfield Baptist Church, a congregation that supposedly vanished during an earthquake in 1755. According to her research, the entire church had been holding Sunday service when the ground opened up and swallowed the building whole. Local legends claim you can still hear them singing, she'd written in her journal. Investigation needed to determine historical accuracy of burial site. Well, she'd found her historical accuracy. The dogs wouldn't go near the excavation site. They'd get within 50 feet of that steeple and start whining, hackles up, pulling their handlers back toward the trail. The electronic equipment we brought up there went haywire too. Radios filled with static that almost sounded like voices, metal detectors screaming like banshees, cameras that showed images of people who weren't there. It was Sheriff Morrison who found Michael Gospel. Michael had been the group's musician, carrying a guitar for documenting traditional mountain songs. Morrison discovered him standing in a grove of dead pine trees about a quarter mile from the excavation site. But Michael wasn't alone. He was conducting what looked like a full choir. Men, women, and children all dressed in old-fashioned church clothes. They were singing Rock of Ages in perfect harmony. The problem was, there was nobody there. Morrison watched Michael wave his arms, directing an invisible congregation through verse after verse, his lips moving like he was singing, nang along. When the sheriff called out to him, Michael turned with that same peaceful, wrong smile I'd seen on Mary. "Sheriff Morrison," Michael said in a voice that carried more authority than any 22-year-old should have. "How wonderful that you've come to join our choir. The Reverend has been expecting you." Morrison tried to grab the boy, but Michael just stepped backward and disappeared. Not gradually, not behind a tree, just gone, like he'd never been there. The sheriff stood there for 10 minutes, listening to the singing continue all around him, but he was alone in those dead pines. That evening, we found the rest of Dr. Stone's team. Professor Stone herself was sitting in what looked like a church pew that had somehow grown up through the forest floor, her research notes spread across her lap like hymn books. She was taking notes on a sermon only she could hear, writing down the words of Reverend Tombstone in neat academic handwriting. Tom Bradley, Lisa Park, Mike Santos, Bobby Kim, Jenny Walsh, and Carlos Rodriguez, all arranged in pews that formed a congregation in the middle of the woods. They looked like they were participating in Sunday service, singing along with voices we couldn't hear, listening to preaching that chilled the air around them. And at the front of this impossible church, behind a pulpit made of twisted roots and old stone, stood Reverend Ezekiel Tombstone himself. I saw him clear as day when we crested the hill, tall and thin as a scarecrow, dressed in a black coat that might have been fashionable 200 years ago. His face was all sharp angles and shadow, skin stretched tight over bones that looked too long. When he smiled at us, his teeth were yellow as old piano keys. "Welcome," he said in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Welcome to Thornfield Baptist Church. Service is just beginning, the students." Ents turned to look at us with those same peaceful, empty smiles. Dr. Stone raised her hand like she was answering a question in class. The Reverend has been explaining about the eternal service, she said. How we must worship without ceasing until we prove our worthiness for salvation. Isn't it wonderful? Behind Tombstone, I could see the church itself rising up from the earth. Not a ruin, but a complete building made of shadows and starlight. The steeple we'd found was just the tip. The whole congregation was down there, had been down there for over 200 years, singing the same songs and listening to the same sermon. We have room for everyone, Tombstone said, his eyes fixed on me. Room in our congregation for all who would serve the Lord. Morrison reached for his sidearm, but his hand passed right through it. The other Rangers tried their radios, but all that came through was organ music and the sound of 100 voices raised in hymn. You cannot fight faith, Tombstone continued. You cannot arrest salvation. You can only choose, join our service, or remain outside in the cold and dark. The trees around us began to change, bark turning to wood paneling, branches forming the framework of a vast church ceiling. The ground beneath our feet shifted from forest floor to polished wooden planks. Pews rose up like mushrooms after rain, filled with congregants whose faces I recognized from old photographs and newspaper clippings, people who had gone missing on this mountain over the decades. The service is eternal, Tombstone proclaimed. The service is salvation. The service is all. I ran again. Seems like that's all I was good for. But this time, I had a destination. Dr. Stone's research notes had mentioned something about the original Thornfield Baptist Church, something that hadn't made sense until I saw Reverend Tombstone with my own eyes. The church hadn't been swallowed by an earthquake. It had been buried on purpose. I made it back to the ranger station and dug through our historical files, looking for anything about Crying Wooma and Mountain in the 1750s. What I found in a folder of old surveyor reports made my blood turn to ice water. Thornfield Baptist had been founded by Ezekiel Tombstone in 1753, and from the beginning, it had been wrong. Tombstone preached that salvation could only be achieved through absolute devotion. His followers had to prove their faith by giving up everything, including their lives. He practiced ritual burial of living congregation members, convincing them that dying in service to God would guarantee their place in heaven. The colonial authorities had tried to stop him, but Tombstone's followers were fanatics. They'd rather die than abandon their preacher. So the local militia had taken matters into their own hands. On Easter Sunday, 1755, they'd surrounded the church during service and buried the entire building with everyone inside. The earthquake story was just a cover-up. 200 people had been buried alive while Tombstone led them in their final hymn. But here's the thing about fanatics. Death doesn't always stop them. I loaded up my truck with everything I could think of. Shovels, dynamite left over from trail clearing, my grandfather's Bible, and a bottle of whiskey for courage. If I was going to face down a dead preacher and his zombie congregation, I figured I'd need all the help I could get. The drive up to Crying Woman Mountain at night was like entering another world. The trees leaned in over the road like they were trying to block my way, and my headlights kept catching glimpses of people in old-fashioned clothes walking through the forest. The radio played nothing but funeral hymns, even when I turned it off. At the excavation site, the entire church had risen from the ground. It stood there in the moonlight like something from a nightmare. A complete 18th century church building, bell tower and all, with warm light glowing through the windows, and the sound of active worship spilling out into the night. I could see them all through the windows, Dr. Stone's research team sitting in the pews alongside people who'd been dead for centuries. They were singing Amazing Grace, but the melody was all wrong, twisted into something that sounded more like a lament than a hymn of joy. At the pulpit, Reverend Tombstone was preaching about the glory of eternal service, about how his followers would worship God forever, proving their devotion through endless repetition of ritual and song. His congregation hung on every word, nodding and swaying with the rhythm of his speech. I pushed open the church doors and walked down the center aisle. Every eye in the place turned to look at me. Hundreds of faces from different centuries, all wearing the same peaceful, empty expression. "Welcome, sister," Tombstone said from his pulpit. "I've been expecting you." Your seminary training makes you particularly suited for our ministry." That's when I realized he knew. Somehow this dead preacher knew about my past, my lost faith, my search for meaning in the wilderness. "I was like you once," he continued, questioning, searching, wondering if God truly heard our prayers. But here, in eternal service, there is no doubt. Only worship, only devotion, only the certainty of salvation through endless praise. Dr. Stone stood up from her pew and smiled at me. "It's beautiful, Kate. No more questions, no more doubt. Just faith, pure and simple, forever and ever." I pulled out my grandfather's Bible, the same one he'd used to preach in these mountains back when I was a girl. "That's not faith," I said, my voice echoing in the impossible church. "That's fear. You're not worshiping God. You're hiding from him." Tombstone's face darkened. "You dare speak heresy in the house of the Lord?" "This isn't God's house," I shot back. "It's a tomb. You've turned faith into a prison, worship into a cage. These people aren't saved. They're trapped." I opened the Bible and began reading from the Gospel of John, words I'd memorized back in seminary. "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life." The congregation began to murmur, some looking confused for the first time in centuries. "God doesn't want your fear," I continued, walking toward the pulpit. "He doesn't want endless repetition and mindless devotion. He wants your love, freely given. He wants your joy, not your terror." Tombstone raised his hands, and the church began to shake. "Silence! You will not corrupt my flock with false teachings." But I kept reading, kept walking, kept speaking the words of love and redemption that I'd forgotten I believed in. With each step, the church grew dimmer, the congregation more restless. Some of the older members, the ones who'd been buried alive in 1755, began to fade, peaceful smiles replacing the empty devotion on their faces. "Thank you," whispered a woman in colonial dress as she dissolved into light. "Thank you for setting us free." By the time I reached the pulpit, half the congregation was gone, released from their centuries of false worship. Dr. Stone and her students were blinking like people waking from a long dream. Tombstone himself was changing too, the authority and menace draining out of him. Without his congregation's forced devotion, he was just a frightened man who'd lost his way centuries ago. "I only wanted to serve," he whispered as his form began to fade. "I only wanted to be worthy." "You already were," I told him. "We all are." When the sun rose over Crying Woman Mountain, there was nothing left of Thornfield Baptist Church but an empty foundation and some scattered stones. Dr. Stone and her students remembered everything: the singing, the preaching, the feeling of being trapped in endless worship. But they were alive and themselves again. We never filed an official report about what really happens. Ned up there. How do you explain a zombie preacher and his buried congregation to people who weren't there? The students agreed to say they'd been lost in a cave system and had wandered for days before finding their way out. Dr. Stone published a paper about local folklore, but she never mentioned the night she spent in an impossible church. As for David Faithfull, we found his body in a natural grave near the foundation. He looked peaceful, like he'd died in his sleep, and there were wildflowers growing all around him. The coroner ruled it a heart attack brought on by exhaustion and exposure. Sometimes the simplest explanation is the kindest one. I stayed on as a park ranger for 2 more years, but something had changed in me up there in that buried church. My faith had come back, but it was different now. Less about fear and rules, more about love and understanding. I eventually went back to seminary, finished my training, and now I serve as a chaplain for folks in these mountains who need someone to listen. I still hike up to Crying Woman Mountain sometimes, especially on Easter Sunday. If you know where to look, you can still find the old foundation stones scattered through the clearing. And sometimes, if the wind is right and you're real quiet, you might hear the faint sound of singing coming up from the earth. But it's different now. Not the desperate, fearful hymns of Tombstone's congregation, but something joyful and free. the voices of people who found their way home at last. The trail is closed to hikers these days, officially because of unstable ground conditions. But every spring I find fresh flowers growing in cross patterns near where the church used to stand, and occasionally search and rescue gets calls about people hearing church bells in the distance. Most of the time it's just the wind through the pines or maybe a bird with an unusual song. But sometimes when the moon is dark and the air is still, I think there are still folks wandering these mountains looking for the peace they never found in life. I leave water bottles and inner GI bars at the trail markers, just in case. And I always carry my grandfather's Bible, because you never know when someone might need to hear about the kind of faith that sets you free instead of locking you up. Faith isn't about perfect worship or endless devotion. It's about love and hope and the courage to keep walking even when you can't see the path ahead. That's what I learned on Crying Woman Mountain, in a church that should never have existed, from a congregation that sang for 2 centuries before they remembered how to rest. Some lessons are worth digging up from the grave,